Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chapter 96, Fierce Battle, Gathering. Countless arrows made of ice fell from the sky. This spell has a slow effect and every arrow was filled with mana, that's why the spell was dangerous. Souta raised Bonnie's body and used him as a shield. He turned his head and looked at Lin in the eyes. Lin suppressed herself to not move her eyes. She met Souta's gaze with her own even though she was embarrassed. She wanted him to believe in her. Lin's senses were unusually sharp the moment she was born. Especially, her awareness over energy like mana. She was very confident in this ability of hers. She wanted to make herself useful to Souta even once. Believe in me, Souta. Please. Lin prayed in her mind. She saw Souta looked at the direction that she said. She was nervous, wondering if Souta would believe her. Souta released Bonnie from his grasp as he decided that if Bonnie took any more damage then his condition would worsen just like Mei. He turned his head and looked at Jiren who was protecting Sina and Mei. Then, at Mark who was defending against the arrows from the sky. Thanks for protecting me. He gripped Bonnie and threw him towards Mark. Here's your friend. If he wakes up later tell me thanks for protecting me. You. Mark looked at him with clear anger painted on his face. Souta was treating everyone here like a disposable tool that he could get rid of any time he wanted. Souta then turned his head to the direction that Lin pointed. He charged towards it without hesitation. He wouldn't doubt her for something like this. Ever since he started to gather the flags of other classes, Lin didn't say anything. She just watched him quietly from the sidelines. But now, she said something to him. It only means that she wanted to make use of herself to him. He bent his knees and launched himself towards that direction. He moved his body from side to side to avoid the arrows, but there were too many arrows he couldn't dodge them all. Some of them even pierced his body. Since this was the case, Souta used dash and ran in a straight line. He ignored the arrows that were falling on his body. When he was closer to the caster of the Tier 2 spell, Souta jumped in the air. He saw the caster was a slender man with long blonde hair. The man had pointed ears and soft skin. He was no doubt an elf. This man was none other than the top 2 ranker, Erlen Woodknight. Souta was about to cast a spell towards Erlen when 2 figures appeared beside him. Souta was caught off guard and the 2 figures threw a powerful punch on his stomach. Souta was thrown on the ground and it slightly shook the ground. His body was deeply embedded in the hard rock. Jiren and the others looked over. They saw Souta crashed on the ground. The others are here. Jiren muttered and he looked at the direction where Souta came from. He saw 3 people. The man in the center was the top 2 ranker who once defeated him, Erlen Woodknight. The other 2 were the top 4 ranker and the top 5 ranker. The top 4 ranker was a man with a large build. Although his build was like those of a brawler class, this man was a full-fledged mage. His short black hair and sharp black eyes were gleaming with intent to fight. He was Grunge Hyun, of the Hyun clan from the royal capital of the Hebre kingdom. The top 5 ranker was a woman with a voluptuous body. Her long black silky hair fluttered as the wind blew. Her brown eyes were staring at the place where Souta crashed. She was holding a long silver staff in her right hand. She was Aileen Carnane. These 3 people were from the mage class 1A. The true force of the mage class. The people who attacked Souta's class were just another group of the red flag collector just like Brian's group to his class. Aileen opened her mouth and said, "That man, he's really something. Even though we surprised him he managed to counter us in that instant. Yeah, I saw in the ranking battles how he beat some of our classmates." Grunge nodded at her words. His right hand and Aileen's left hand were bleeding. When they appeared beside Souta, Souta quickly pulled the Vajra sword Saya that was hanging on his waist. The moment they threw a punch towards him, Souta knew that he couldn't avoid it as he just used air walk, so he slashed his sword on their hand to reduce the force of their punch. Aileen tapped her staff on the ground and cast heal on herself and Grunge. This spell was the advanced version of light heal, so their wounds immediately stopped bleeding. Grunge looked at his right hand. He opened and closed his palm before he stretched it. He then said, "It's good, I can use this hand in a fight. His strength is stronger than his rank." Aileen said in a low voice while gazing at the place which was covered in smoke and dust. Erlen stopped his spell as it was draining too much of his mana. He glanced at the place where Aileen was looking and shook his head. He looked at Jiren and said, "To think that man would trouble you this much, Jiren. I guess you haven't improved since the last time that we fought." You wouldn't understand it if you haven't fought him. I already acknowledge his strength and you will experience it too since you are here. Jiren said to Erlen. He acknowledged how powerful and tricky Souta is. He wondered if he will lose all of his flags in this situation. Mei and Bonnie were down. They couldn't help him. He could only count on Sina and Mark. Jiren sighed and he closed his eyes. He then heard several footsteps. Opening his eyes, he saw a lot of people coming to this place. It seems that we have other visitors. All the powerful fighters of the first year arrived in this place. They came from different class and they all have one goal in this place. And that was to gather all the red flags that other classes gathered. Erlen looked around and smirked. It seems that it's going to be a battle of the class. We will see who's going to win in the end. He was also surprised to see the other classes arrived in this place. But this wouldn't stop him from achieving his goals. Aileen removed her gaze from the place where Souta crashed and she looked at the newly arrived people. She opened her mouth and said, "It's going to get a little chaotic." Hee, that's fine for me. I wanted to fight them all. Grunge laughed lightly. Mark, Sina, prepare for battle. No, just focus on protecting yourself. I will go all out. Jiren said to his two comrades. The top 1 up to top 30 was here in this place except for a few people. Most of the people that arrived here were powerful on their own. They could handle themselves in the upcoming fight. Since the people here were from different classes, they were also surprised to see everyone that arrived here in this place. Erlen looked at everyone and said, "Too bad, Yuriko is not here. If she's here then it would be nice as the top 1 and top 2 are present in this place." He didn't know that the top 3 ranker Yuriko got defeated by Randolph when she was attacking the mage class 1B. He would be shocked if he heard this in the future. An unranked person defeated the only top 3 ranker of the first year. Lin hid herself carefully. She didn't dare to utter any kind of sound. She was afraid that these people would take the flags that she was holding. Nevertheless, she was stunned when she saw the powerful first years arrived in this place one by one. But she never focused her attention on them. She looked at the place where Souta crashed with a worried look. She wanted to go there herself but she managed to hold back. She knew it, that once she revealed herself those people would target her because of the amount of red flags that she was holding. She remembered what Souta said to her before. No matter what happens, don't let go of the flags and he will think about how to deal with the opponents. Souta left these flags in my protection and he trusted me. So I know that he will do something about them. Lin thought. Souta was still lying down on the small crater while resting on his hand. He lifted up the Vajra sword Saya and muttered, "Is it okay for me to use this?" He was hesitating whether he should use the sword or not. It's true that if he used the sword he could handle most of the students in this place, but there's a risk. What if the sword tried to take over his mind once again? Well, I hope you don't attack me, Saya. Chapter 97, Fierce Battle, 5 minutes. Souta was lying on the ground while looking at the Vajra sword Saya on his hand. He opened his mouth and said, "Oi! Red lady, are you there?" After a few moments, he hasn't heard anything at all. There's no reply and it seems that the sword wasn't going to bother him for a while. He then tried to call her once again but to no avail, she hasn't responded at all to his call. He wanted to know what her stance. If she was his enemy or ally. In truth, he doesn't want her to become his enemy as the sword was useful to him. It gave him a large boost to his stats and the equipment skill really helped him in his expedition on the desolate forest. He wouldn't be able to defeat the night leaders if not for the equipment skill of the sword and the added stats. No matter how much he predicted his opponent's movement, if his stats were too low compared to his opponent then he wouldn't be able to react fast enough. Before he could react he would receive a blow from his opponent. That's what will happen if the gap in stats was too large. He then averted his attention and heard a lot of people in his surrounding. Something is happening around me. That's favorable for me as well as I don't need to go to their class to collect their red flags. Souta muttered and he slowly stood up. He patted the dirt and dust on his clothes. He then felt the ground shake. It only means that the battle already started and he could only hope that they didn't discover Lin. The gust of wind blew the thick smoke that was covering this area. It revealed him to the rest of the people in this place. But most of them didn't have time to look at him as they were busy fighting each other. What are you doing? Since you all are ignoring me, then let me collect your red flags. Souta muttered and he placed his hand on his chin. He swept his eyes over the people that were present here. He counted the people that were holding the flags since they were his target. Jiren, Mark, and Sina glanced at him wondering what he would do in this situation. But they have no time to watch him as their opponent attacked them. Jiren jumped away to create a distance from his foe. He was fighting the top 2 ranker Erlen and some of the students from other classes. He got his hands full of these people, just Erlen alone was giving him a hard time and now other people joined the battle to take him down. Some of the other students decided together that taking him down would be important if they wanted to collect the red flags, so they decided to work together. But some of the students didn't want that as they knew that they were next once they managed to take down the top 1 ranker. That's why Jiren was fighting a lot of people at the same time. Erlen, who was launching spell at Jiren, didn't even notice it. He was too busy trying to take down the top 1 ranker who defeated him. Even with the help of other people, He still couldn't catch Jiren at all. Tisk. This trash. Erlen clicked his tongue while looking at the people who were attacking Jiren. Aileen was the one who noticed Souta, not Grunge. Grunge was enjoying himself while fighting other students at the same time. She tapped her staff on the ground and created a barrier around herself. She then waved her staff and the floor around her quickly turned into ice. And once again she cast another barrier around her. This is enough. Aileen muttered before she turned her head and looked at Souta. She saw Souta eyes were looking at every people here in this place. She wondered what he was planning to do. Souta looked around and muttered, if Brian is here, then he would join the battle without hesitation. Well, me too. He started to circulate his mana around his body. He looked at his sword one more time. He was actually reluctant to use the sword after what happened last time when he evolved. He took a deep breath and slightly bent his knees. With a boom he charged towards the nearest person who was holding the red flags. I got you, Souta said as he grinned and slashed his sword towards the man. The man was surprised when he saw Souta appeared in front of him. He tried to move away but it was too late. The sword was already on its way towards him and he knew that he couldn't avoid it. Arg. A large cut appeared in the chest of the man. Blood spurted out of the wound on his chest. Souta moved his hand and grabbed the red flags on the man's hand. He forcefully yanked out the flags out of his hand. He then lifted up his feet and kicked the man's chest. The man flew away and crashed on the ground. This alerted the people around the place. They all stopped moving and looked at Souta who was holding the red flags that he snatched from the man. Souta looked at them and he slowly opened his mouth and said, let's fight and see who will win. He slowly raised his palm and cast Shadow Bind spell along with Shadow Spike spell. Erlen looked on the ground and immediately jumped. Jump. He shouted to his comrades. Aileen jumped in the air and pointed her staff on him. She gathered her mana and cast the spell. Mana bullet. Dozen small bluish balls appeared beside her. The bluish balls shot towards him quickly. Souta threw the flags that he was holding in the sky. He then swiftly avoided the mana bullet spell that Aileen cast. Oh ho, that's dangerous you know. Souta said as he then swept his eyes in the area around him. He found another student who was holding red flags. He charged towards that student while using dash skill. In just a moment, he arrived in front of the student. Souta used Shadow Bind and slashed his sword. He then grabbed the flags and kicked the student away from him. Suddenly, he ducked down as a fist passed above his head. Souta glanced and saw Grunge, the top 4 ranker of the first year. He slashed his sword horizontally but Grunge took a step back and avoided his sword easily. He gripped the red flags that he was holding tightly before he threw it towards Grunge. Grunge stepped aside to avoid the flags and he launched himself towards Souta. Suddenly, he found his feet being stuck on the ground. Grunge looked down and saw that the ground turned into mud. I will fight you later. Souta smiled at him before he turned around and charged towards the student who was holding the red flags. His target this time was the students who have red flags. Souta doesn't want anyone in this place to collect the red flags. He will avoid any fight except for those who have red flags. His Shadow Bind and Shadow Spike spells knocked a few of students that gathered in this place. It removed the weaklings from the strong, so only people who possessed some power were standing in this place. All of them were top 1 to top 30 ranker and a few ones who were saved by their comrades just like those people who were holding the red flags. Erlen frowned at this and said, after him. Aileen and Grunge looked at Erlen and nodded their heads. They chased Souta who was running around the battlefield. Erlen cast a spell to stop Aileen and Grunge's opponents. He will handle these people but he was worried that Jiren would attack him. He turned his head and glanced at Jiren. He found that Jiren was fighting the other students. Haha, catch me if you can. Souta laughed as Aileen and Grunge chased him with all of they've got. He moved around and jumped on top of the tree before he jumped down again. The two people were having a hard time to follow his movements. While he was running around, he picked up the flags of the Brawler Class 1A that were scattered on the ground. What is he planning to do? Did he run around just to get the red flags or did he have another motive? I couldn't tell at all. Aileen thought as she was trying to guess what's his motive behind his action. You. Come back here and fight me. Grunge shouted at the top of his lungs. He opened both of his palms and cast a spell towards Souta. I will fight you later, Souta replied with a laugh and moved his body to avoid the spell. So, wait for it. I will fight you with my full power. Remaining time before the test ends, 5 minutes. Chapter 98, Fierce Battle, I didn't say you could touch her. Souta arrived in front of a man who was holding the red flags. He tightened his grip on his sword and waved the Vajra sword towards the man. Just like before, Souta took the red flags on the hand on the man. Souta grinned before he kicked the man away. The man flew and crashed into the trees. It caused the trees to shake and the leaves to fell on the ground. Just a little bit more, Souta muttered as he looked at the students who were holding the red flags. There's only a few of them left. He would be able to knock them down with the remaining time that he has. Souta felt the mana fluctuations in the air. It was too dense, so he looked up and found himself being cornered as different spells were cast towards his direction. He finally incurred the wrath of the students here in this place. There's too many of them, Souta said in a low voice when he saw this scene. He looked at every corner where he could cast his shadow ball. In the end, he gave up on using shadow ball spell. At least 1 or 2 spells would hit the shadow ball if he cast it in any direction. The spell will explode and it will lose its effect to switch position with the user. Then, avoiding the spells. There were too many spells to avoid, so he knew that it's futile if he tried to avoid the spells. The spells covered all the escape routes that he could think of. Since this was the case, he had no choice but to block this using his body. He had an object that could take these spells without getting a scratch. And that's the dark grade weapon Vajra sword Saya. Erlen glanced at the 3 unconscious people in front of him. He just defeated his opponents at this time. He turned his head and saw that Souta was being cornered by the students. He looked around and found something. He knew that Souta would be having a hard time with a lot of people targeting him, including Aileen and Grunge. So that's your plan, huh? Okay, let's do this, Souta said with a smirk on his face. He moved his left hand and threw the red flags that he was holding in the sky. He tightened his grip on the sword and it emitted a red light. When a ball of fire was close to him, Souta quickly waved the sword in his hand. A red light flashed and it hit several spells in the mid-air. Boom. Boom. It caused the spells to explode in the mid-air even without hitting their target. Ha! Souta waved the Vajra sword once again. It caused several explosions to occur in the mid-air. Souta slashed the sword with intent to eradicate all the spells that were heading towards him. He continued waving it in every direction. Still, some of the spells slipped on his guard and it landed on his body. No matter how strong he is, he's still a first-year student and he couldn't block countless spells that were aimed at his body in every direction. After a few moments, Souta was still standing on his place with a few wounds on his body. Everyone was looking at him with widened eyes. They were surprised when they saw how he slashed those spells. Really? He smiled and looked down on his hand. He saw that his hand was trembling. It was because he used the equipment skill of the Vajra sword Saya in a short amount of time. This is the side effect of using the equipment skill of the sword continuously. Souta looked at his stats and saw that he still have a lot of health points and stamina, but his mana was less than half of his total mana. This is bad. Without mana I would have a hard time fighting all the students here, Souta thought while looking at his stats. Well, it would only give him some trouble. It's not enough to defeat him as he was confident in his physical ability. If he was a pure mage, then he would truly lose against these students as a pure mage was dependent on the amount of mana he had. Right now, Souta's stats were balanced, so even if he drained his mana he still could fight using his physical ability. He still has combat arts to use even if he couldn't use his spell. This was important to him. Currently, Souta doesn't know a lot of spells. He only knew a couple of it, but the specialty spell he knew was only 3. The Shadow Bind, Shadow Spike, and Shadow Ball spells were the spells that came from the skill tree of Darkness specialty. It would only increase while raising the rank of his class. Okay, I will use all of my mana without holding back, Souta said in a low voice as his gaze swept around the students in the area. Grunge and Aileen recovered from the shock they felt. Grunge clenched his fist and he gathered his mana. He raised fist and aimed it at Souta. Explode, burst ground. He shouted as he cast the spell towards Souta. Souta glanced on the ground before he quickly rolled to the side. The ground at which he was standing earlier exploded. Flames burst out like a fountain. Souta looked at the spell with a frown on his face. That was dangerous. The grade of that spell was close to tier 2 spell. He would lose a large amount of his health if that spell hit him. Let finish you right now. Souta looked at Grunge and said with a grin. He gripped the sword tightly and dashed towards Grunge. Souta used dash skill to increase his speed. Suddenly, a wall of emerged from the ground in front of Grunge. Wall of stone. Aileen cast it as she knew that Souta targeted Grunge, her comrade. She wouldn't let Grunge fight Souta alone. She knew that Souta wasn't an easy opponent just from what he showed before. Souta continued to dash forward even when the wall appeared in front of Grunge. After a few moments, he arrived in front of the wall of stone spell. He waved the sword and the wall was sliced in half. The upper part of the wall fell down on the ground with a loud thud sound. Behind the wall was Grunge. Souta saw Grunge smiling at him while opening both of his palms. Grunge's mana was fluctuating highly. He was ready to cast a spell at any time. That's... Souta frowned while looking at it. Air burst. The air gathered on Grunge's palm. It turned into a ball of wind before it shot towards Souta with powerful momentum. I already expected this, you know. Souta grinned and he raised his left hand. He watched the timing and speed of the spell before he waved his left hand. The ball of wind crashed the ground behind him and it caused a deep pit. Souta managed to divert the spell using his left hand, but it was not without consequences. The skin on his left hand was grazed. The people around him could see his bare flesh. Grunge was shocked when he saw this. He looked at Souta's hand in a daze. Souta used this chance to slash his sword. A large cut appeared on Grunge's chest, but Souta wasn't done yet. He slashed his sword once again and another cut appeared on Grunge's body. Arg! Grunge groaned as a large amount of blood spurted out of his chest. This is what you want, right? Souta kicked Grunge in the air. He looked up at Grunge and chased after it. With a jump, Souta appeared in front of Grunge. He pulled back his left hand and clenched his fist. Shadow Spike. Souta muttered as black spikes emerged from the ground, and then he threw a powerful punch on Grunge's body. Grunge flew and crashed in the ground, which was full of spikes. The ground trembled as his body crashed with powerful momentum. It hurts. Souta complained in his mind. He still could bear the pain he felt on his left hand. Well, it's not the first time that he experienced this. Before, when he was fighting the Red Lady of the Vajra sword, he once sacrificed his left hand to save the people. That injury was more serious than this one. Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. Kaie. I know that something was wrong when he tossed those flags in the air. But luckily I noticed that it was heading in the same direction. Souta turned around and saw Erlin, the top 2 ranker, was approaching Lin. Lin was holding a bunch of flags in her arms. Erlin's mana was fluctuating as he approached Lin. This is bad. That guy, Erlin, is the top 2 while Lin is just an ordinary student. She would be easily defeated if they fought. Huff. Souta took a deep breath and held his breath. The grin on his face slowly vanished and it was replaced by a cold one. He slightly bent his knees and his muscles bulged out. Agility boost, strength boost, cat speed, triple muscle strengthening, dash. Souta used his combat arts and spell as he charged towards Erlin with all of his strength. He used all of his stats without holding back. It was so fast that in just 2 seconds Souta arrived beside Erlin. He opened his palm and tried to grab Erlin's face. I didn't say that you could touch her. I'll kill you, you know. Chapter 99, Fierce Battle, Level 9 Shadowbind. So fast. Aileen was surprised when she saw his speed. To think that Souta didn't even use his full speed when she was chasing him. She turned her head to where Souta was heading and saw her classmate, Erlin the top 2 ranker, and a girl with purple color hair. The girl was holding a bunch of red flags. So that's how it is. Aileen muttered as she finally understood why Souta was throwing the red flags. Souta wasn't just randomly throwing those flags. He was throwing it towards his partner, and that partner was that girl with purple hair. This man surprised her again and again. Really incredible. Erlin's mana flared up as he was going to attack Lin. However, just as Erlin was about to cast a spell, his expression changed slightly. He stopped moving as he felt someone at his side. He felt danger coming beside him. Souta arrived beside Erlin in just a few moments. He opened his palm and reached it out towards Erlin's face. I didn't say that you could touch her. I'll kill you, you know. Souta said in a cold tone. Souta. Lin looked at him with a surprised expression. Souta grabbed Erlin's face and smashed him on the ground. He continued to move forward while gripping Erlin's face. It created a 1 meter deep and 2 meter wide scar on the ground. The trees that were in their way were uprooted and crashed into tiny pieces. Release me. Erlin tried to say something to Souta. He raised his hand and grabbed Souta's wrist. He felt extreme pain as Souta was using his body to open up the ground. Umph. Souta snorted as he tightened his grip and gathered his mana on his palm. Arg. Erlin felt extreme heat on Souta's hand, which was gripping his face. The burning sensation he felt was becoming unbearable. Fireball. Souta cast the very first spell that he learned in this world. Since he was gripping Erlin's face and he used his palm to cast the spell. The spell immediately exploded as soon as it appeared. He then threw Erlin away before casting another fireball spell. Erlin crashed on the ground and his face was covered in smoke. Then, a ball of fire flew towards his body and exploded. Aileen and other students looked at this with a stunned expression. They watched how Souta took care of the top 2 ranker of the whole first year just like that. He's strong. Jiren muttered while looking at Souta's figure. He already knocked 2 out of 5 people that were trying to pull him down. Right now, Sina and Mark helped him handle the remaining 3. It was because they wanted him to restore his energy. I thought before that I'm the strongest first year in this institute, but it seems that I was wrong. He said in a low voice. The other students subconsciously took a step back when they saw Souta turned his head to look at them. They gulped as Souta grinned widely. Souta swept his gaze at everyone and slowly opened his mouth. I will beat everyone here. He provoked everyone. If he did this, then some of them would step back and some were not. He wanted to decrease his opponent this time as he was exhausted and he was about to fall any second right now. The wounds that he received before were bleeding and it made him lose his strength faster than before. He was only trying to put up a strong front to intimidate some of them as he knew that he couldn't intimidate everyone here, like that top 1 ranker who could go toe-to-toe to him if he didn't use the Vajra sword. Suddenly, he felt a warm feeling on his back. Souta turned his head and saw Lin using Light Heal on him. Light Heal was a spell that wasn't effective to the caster. It could only heal the wounds of other people except for the caster. Above this spell was the advanced version called Heal. It could do the thing that Light Heal couldn't. Lin wasn't a powerful fighter or mage, but she at least knew several basic spells. She didn't study seriously before and didn't listen to Bargain's lectures. She was regretting it right now. She regretted that she didn't have enough strength to support Souta. All she could do was watch Souta fight and get injured. Since they've found me, I don't need to hide anymore. I'm sorry. I couldn't help you. Lin apologized to him. Actually, she was holding herself back when she saw Souta receiving wounds from his opponents. She really wanted to help him and treat his wounds, but she knew that she has a role to fulfill. And that's collecting the red flags that Souta gave her and protect it. Also, even if she rushed towards him at that time, she knew that she didn't have the strength to help him. She would just become a burden to him, and that's what she didn't want to happen. Souta smiled at her and said, "You don't have to apologize. I already said before that I will deal with this alone." He turned around and patted her head. "Yeah." Lin blushed from the sudden contact. Her face turned red as she lowered her head. "Thanks, this is enough for me." Souta thanked her and removed his hand. "It's really hard to pat someone who's taller than you." It became awkward. Well, that doesn't even matter now as most of his wounds stopped bleeding. His wounds weren't completely healed. Light Heal was just first aid. It couldn't completely heal wounds like these as it could only use to stop the bleeding. At least he avoided her healing his left hand. His deep wounds and blood were covering the true form of his hand. Even though it hurts like hell, he still could injure it. The blue-grade gloves that he was wearing were gone. The glove on his right hand was safe. The only problem was his left hand. "I know some spell and these will help you." Lin shook her head and said. She then cast a buff spell towards Souta. Lesser strength. Reinforce energy. This will help me a lot. "You can go now, bring those flags away," Souta said as he stretched his arm. He was feeling better now that Lin cast low-level buff spells on him. Suddenly, everyone heard a loud whistling sound and it was followed by an explosion. Everyone looked up and heard a voice. Remaining time on special test. 1 minute. The voice wasn't loud nor soft, strangely every student in the whole mountain heard it. The voice was imbued with mana and a special auxiliary spell. It lets a simple voice be heard throughout the whole mountain. Really, what a good timing. Souta smiled wryly when he heard the voice. He knew what will happen next. He turned to Lin once again and said, "You can go now, you will become the target." He said these words with a serious expression on his face. "Oh, okay." Lin nodded her head as she tightly gripped the red flags in her arms. Since she was holding most of the red flags in this place, she will become the target of every class. It will become a battle to defend her within 1 minute. As long as she kept holding these flags, then it would become the points of their class as soon as the special test ends. Protecting Lin for 1 minute is not a problem for me. Souta grinned widely. His intimidation before wasn't going to be effective in this situation. They were going to stake everything just to get the flags from Lin. "Everyone, let's work together and take the red flags from her." Aileen shouted, and this what she wanted. Everyone nodded their heads at her words. All of them have a gloomy expression in their face. It was because the girl behind Souta was holding more than 10 red flags. Souta used his skill points to raise the level of Shadow Bind spell to level 9, leaving him 4 skill points left. He then quickly cast it before anyone could approach Lin. Several shadows burst out of the ground. Aileen and the other quickly jumped away, but they noticed something different. The shadows were many times faster than before, so it bound all of their feet. They didn't manage to escape as this was out of their expectations. "What?" Aileen was surprised at this, then she waved her staff to break the shadows, but she noticed that it was tougher than before. She lifted up her head and looked at Souta. She saw him grinning while looking at them. Not good. She guessed that Souta was about to do something about them. "All of you are staying here." Souta cast Shadow Spike spell. Several spikes burst out of the ground and it pierced their feet. All of them screamed in pain. "In this special test, we win." Souta looked at them and said. They wouldn't be able to follow Lin since he injured their feet. They wouldn't be able to run properly with a hole in their feet. Jiren, who was watching at the sideline, sighed at this. He knew that Souta's class was going to take the highest score in this special test. "It seems that I still need to train harder and catch up to his strength," he muttered in a low voice while looking at Souta's figure. He just waited for the special test to end. After a few dozen seconds, A loud bell rang in the whole mountain. It only means that the special test ends. Chapter 100, End of Special Test. A loud bell rang in the whole mountain. The students stopped fighting as they looked up in the sky. Souta sighed and he fell down on his knees. He was exhausted and his body was covered in bruises. His left hand was covered in blood and his skin was gone. Huff, that took most of my strength, Souta said in a low voice while gasping. He managed to test the limit of his strength in this special test and he knew that he could fight several first-year students at the same time with his current stats. He guessed that he could probably match those second-year rankers. But he wasn't sure what rank he could fight. The students here in the Ladro Institute was powerful. They were even stronger than those rank E to rank D adventurers. It was especially to the third and fourth year students. That's why most of the students that graduated here become influential people in the country like the city of the Ladro City and the captain of the Royal Guard. Aileen looked at Souta for a few seconds before she turned her head to her comrades. She went beside Irlin and Grunge who was heavily injured. She cast heal on them to stop the bleeding of their wounds. Next time, we will win. We greatly underestimate him this time. She said in a low voice while healing her comrades. That last spell of Souta took her in surprise. The students went to help their injured comrades. Suddenly, a group of teachers appeared before them. They brought the healers of the institute with them. They help and treat the students who suffered injuries in this special test. One of the healers approached Souta. Souta looked at the man who was wearing white clothes and shook his head. You can heal the other first. I can handle myself. Are you sure? The healer asked him, then he looked at Souta's bloody left hand. Yeah, I'm sure. I could still use this hand and it's not that deep. Souta nodded his head and looked at his left hand. Okay, I will heal you later. The healer said to Souta before he turned around and left to heal the other students. Souta looked at the healer's retreating figure. He then heard footsteps coming from behind, so he turned his head and looked at it. He saw Lin walking towards him with flags in her arms. Souta, are you okay? Lin asked him with a concerned look. Nope, I'm not okay as you can see, Souta replied to her and he slowly stood up. I am sorry for asking, then let me help you. Lin walked beside him and held his hand. It's okay, I could still walk. Souta shook his head. He then smiled at her and said, let's go to our campsite. I'm sure the others are waiting for us. Lin looked at his face before she nodded. Yes. I think Mila is worried about us. Mila? Souta looked at her with a questioning gaze. Our class rep. I called her Mila. Lin explained to him. The two talked to the teachers here saying that they will go back to their campsite. The teachers agreed to them and let them go back to the Mage Class 1B campsite. Souta glanced at Lin. He could see that she was excited to go back to the campsite. He opened his mouth and said, You're quite excited to go back. Yeah, I want to show Mila the flags that you collected, Lin said with an excited expression while looking at the flags in her arms. She wanted to tell Lumilia how cool Souta when he was fighting someone. The scene where Souta protected her from Irlin kept repeating in her mind. It's true that I collected those flags alone, but without you, I wouldn't be able to gather a lot of flags. Souta shook his head and said. If he fought alone then it would be a different story. He had to hold the flags while fighting the enemy that was after it. The difficulty was harder if Lin didn't join his group. Lin was surprised when she heard his words. She lowered her head as her face turned red. I didn't do anything. She said in a tiny voice while stuttering. You did something. Souta paused for a moment before he continued, you hold the flags, that's all. Haha. He then laughed at her. You're teasing me. Lin puffed her cheeks. She then remembered something. I did something, I help you stop the bleeding of your wounds. As soon as she mentioned this, she looked down at Souta's left hand. She opened her mouth and asked, Are you really okay? Really I forgot about that. Souta lifted up his left hand and said, This? Yeah, I can handle this. I will treat it back at the campsite. Do you want me to cast a healing spell on you? Lin offered. It's okay, don't waste your mana for something like this. Souta declined her offer. He wouldn't let anyone bother his left hand. It's not a waste if I could heal your wounds, Lin said. Nope, I could handle this. Souta shook his head. He really wanted someone to treat his left hand, but that would reveal its creepy form. So he could only grit his teeth and bear the pain he was feeling. I see. Lin lowered her head in disappointment. She just wanted to help him and nothing else. Souta glanced at her and sighed. Fine, you can heal the other wounds except for this left hand. Really? Lin looked at her. Yes. Souta nodded at her. The two of them walked for a dozen minutes before they arrived at the campsite of the Mage Class 1B. There they saw their homeroom teacher, Bargain, was helping clean the campsite. All the campsite was a battlefield because that's where the red flag of each class stood. It's not just Bargain was here, the healers and cleric of the institute were here and they were healing the students of other class here. Souta looked around and saw the girl named Yuriko among the injured people. Yuriko was the top 3 ranker and it's not easy to injure someone like her. He wondered who caused her to look like that. Lynn looked at him and saw him looking at the injured students. She looked there and didn't saw Brian and Alice. These 2 people were the ones that come to her mind when she thought that Souta was looking for somebody. Lynn knew that Souta was always with these 2. If not Brian, it was Alice. Souta turned his head and saw that the red flag of their class was still in its place. It means that no one managed to take their red flag. He frowned at this. The top 3 ranker was injured in their campsite. If she was here then it means that her target was the red flag of their class. The question is, who among his classmates was capable of stopping the top 3 ranker of the whole first year? Not just stopping her, it even inflicted heavy injuries on her body. Just who is capable of this feat among his classmates? Is it Brian? No, Brian wasn't here so it's literally impossible. Is it Alice? There's a possibility. Souta shook his head and placed those thoughts in the back of his head. He will learn the answer to his question later as he's going to ask the class rep about what really happened here. He looked at Lynn and patted her back. You can go now to Teacher Bargain and let him count the flags that we collected, Souta said. Yes, I will do that. Lynn nodded at him before she ran towards Bargain. Souta looked at her figure before he shook his head. He went inside one of the tents here and asked the cleric for some bandages. He will cover his left hand using the bandages. Lumilia noticed Lynn running towards Bargain with a bunch of red flags. She knew that her partner was Souta, so she looked around and didn't find Souta. She didn't know that Souta was just inside one of the tents bandaging his left hand. After a few minutes, she saw Lynn finish talking to Bargain and gave the red flags to him. Lynn then approached her with hurried steps. Before Lumilia could say anything, Nao who was beside her said something first. Lynn. Where's Souta? What did you 2 do to get that many red flags? Nao said as she placed her hand above her eyes and looked around trying to find Souta. She quickly gave up when she didn't see Souta. She turned her attention to Lynn and checked her body. And looking at you, you still looked the same. You didn't have a single scratch on your body. Actually, Souta was the one who did most of the work. I'm just in the sideline watching his battle. Lynn said with a wry smile. Chapter 101, Quest complete. That's nice. I wish I'm in your position. I don't want to fight. Nao said as she looked down at her body. She showed her bruises on her that she received when she's fighting the students from other classes that were after the red flag. Lynn didn't have a single scratch on her body while she has bruises all over her body. I wish I could do something, Lynn said as she lowered her head. This time, she couldn't do anything. Nao looked at Lynn and she noticed the gloomy atmosphere forming in her. She smiled and patted Lynn. You can do better next time. I'm sure that anyone will fall in love with you if you seriously chase your love. Lynn looked at Nao and smiled. Thanks, Nao. Lumilia walked over and asked, where is Souta? I think that he went inside the tent to clean his wounds. Lynn replied to Lumilia as she looked behind her and tried to find Souta. Lumilia nodded her head and she looked at Lynn. She asked, then, how is it? She was surprised when she asked this because Lynn suddenly grabbed her shoulders. You know, Mila. Souta was super cool when he fought all the top rankers alone. Lynn said with an excited expression. She then lowered her head and said in a shy tone. I think I'm in love with him. Lumilia was stunned when she heard Lynn's words. Nao was shocked beyond words. She then immediately shook her head and said, isn't that too fast? You're only with him with just 1 hour. I bet you and Souta didn't even talk to each other. That's not it, Nao. I really think that I love him. Also, we talk a lot before. He even saved me from the Erlang guy. Lynn said to Nao. She was really acting like a maiden in love. No, she already said that she was in love. So she's really a maiden in love. Really, I couldn't do anything to you. I just don't want you to get hurt. Nao said with a sigh. This friend of hers was really helpless. She then recalled something that Lynn said. Wait. Did you just say that Souta fought all the rankers alone? Lumilia also looked at Lynn. She wanted to ask this but she got distracted because Lynn said that she's in love with Souta. Yeah, isn't that cool? He fought the top 1 alone and even beat them. Lynn said with a proud expression. Why are you proud with the things that you did not do? Nao looked at Lynn with a tired look. Lynn scratched her cheeks. Still, that's pretty impressive. No, that's impressive, Lumilia said with a hint of amazement in her voice. She knew that Souta was strong and had the potential to be the top 1 ranker if he fought seriously, but not to the point where he could fight the rankers at the same time and still manage to beat them. She turned her head and looked at Randolph. Randolph was the man who defeated the top 3 ranker Yuriko with just one spell. She wondered who is stronger among the two of them, Souta or Randolph. After a few minutes, the other group that was tasked to collect the red flags came back to the campsite. Brian's group brought back 3 flags and it was pretty amazing. The other 2 groups brought 1 red flag each while the remaining group didn't manage to collect a single flag. Souta and Lin collected a total of 21 red flags. This shocked everyone and didn't dare to believe when Lin said this. They even asked Bargain for confirmation. It means that their class managed to collect a total of 26 flags. In other words, they already secured first place with just this number. Almost half of the total number of flags was in their possession. There's a chance that one of the class managed to collect the remaining flags. But Souta thought that was impossible. It was because he recalled that he didn't manage to get all the flags on the battlefield before, so if he added those flags then all the flags he has would have exceeded the half of the total amount of flags. There's no one who could get those flags under the protection of those rankers easily. Even Souta took several wounds in that battle. Souta finished cleaning his wounds and bandaging his left hand. It took him a while because of the pain he felt when he cleaned his left hand. Oh, it's complete. Souta wiped the sweat on his forehead. He then heard someone calling him. Souta, are you there? Souta turned his head and guessed that it was Brian because of the voice. He stood up and said, yeah, why? Teacher Bargain is calling everyone, Brian replied from the outside the tent. Okay, I'm coming, Souta said as he exited the tent. Everyone gathered outside of the camp and they went towards the place where every class gathered before. The institute was going to announce whose class has the highest in all classes. And just like what Souta expected, their class was the highest among the other classes. They scored a total of 1,400 points. It was overwhelming as the second place only got 500 points in total. Everyone was happy as they scored the highest in the special test, but they knew that it was all thanks to Souta gathering more than 21 red flags. Naturally, it's all worth it, my effort that is. Souta closed his eyes and smirked. At the same time, he heard a system prompt in his head. Congratulations on completing the quest special test. You've received 10,000 EXP, 5 free attribute points, and 3 skill points. Souta smiled while looking at this. Just a little bit more and he would be able to promote his class to the 2nd rank. His firepower would increase greatly at that time and his ability as a mage. Right now, he learned 3 spells from his specialty darkness. All of this was just the basic spell of a tier 1 darkness attribute spell. His class rank would increase as long as he kept using his skill points in his specialty. He doesn't need to learn all the spells available in his skill tree. He just needed the most important ones which will help him greatly in the future. He used most of his skill points in leveling the Shadowbind spell to 9. It leaves him 4 skill points and right now he received 3 skill points as a reward for the quest that he completed. It needed 10 skill points to level up the Shadowbind spell to 10. It means that he still needed another 3 skill points before he could level up his spell. 3 skill points wasn't a problem to him. 1 week was enough and he would get 3 to 5 skill points. Well, it depends on how busy he is this upcoming week. I will free up my schedule this week, so I could focus myself on getting skill points. Souta thought as he rubbed his chin. Souta snapped out of his thoughts as he noticed that something was wrong. Looking around, he saw that most of the teachers and students were looking at him. I didn't break any rules in the special test. Souta tried to recall if he did something wrong. He tried to guess why they were looking at him like that. It's true that he didn't break any rules. It's just that his combat style was too brutal and merciless. Some of the students were afraid to look in his eyes because of what happened in the test. That's not it, it's not because of that. He then guessed that it was because of his performance in the special test. He fought the rankers that came after him alone using his overwhelming strength. Even the top 1 ranker didn't manage to escape unscathed against him. That's wrong. It's the opposite. They're the ones who are after him. You're becoming more and more famous. A feminine voice sounded beside him. Souta turned his head and saw that it was Alice. Alice really grew closer to him as she's initiating a conversation to him. Before he was the one who would talk first and she merely responded to him. But now, it's different, they could talk like a friend. I wonder about that. Souta shrugged his shoulder as he looked around him. He saw that the people he fought before were looking at him. Jiren, Sina, Mark, Bonnie, and the rest of the rankers. Souta raised his hand, waved at them. Mei quickly looked away. She saw this. She recalled what Souta did to her before and this made her trembled in fear. What did you do to them? Alice asked when she saw that some of the students showed fear at Souta. I just beat them, Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder. Alice and Souta continued chatting. Lin from the side just looked at Souta and Alice who are talking to each other. She wanted to join the conversation but she didn't have the courage to do so. Chapter 102, in the near future. The students went back to the Ladro Institute along with their homeroom teachers. The Mage Class 1B received a large amount of points as they score the highest in the special test. With these points, Souta and the rest could redeem 2 or more combat arts or spell. Well, it all depends on the grade of the spell or combat arts that they will redeem. Souta was planning to exchange the points he received for some high-level combat arts. He also has a plan to let Bargain privately teach him about spells and combat arts. Hiring a teacher to become a student's private tutor cost a lot of points. It was really a good decision that he enrolled in Ladro Institute. Surprisingly, he earned a lot in this place. Right now, Souta was a level 23 Goblin Corruptor. He's slowly getting stronger through the equipments and the skills that he learned. Next time, he planned to acquire some passive skills that will increase his overall combat abilities. There were many ways to get skills. First, was to buy it from a merchant. Second, was to learn it in the institute. Third, was to learn it from the skill tree. And lastly, was to acquire it from the dungeons. But it was hard to get high-level skills from the dungeon as most of the skills that can be found in it were the most basic ones just like his fireball, light heal, and ice shot spells. In the past 2 months, Souta acquired a lot of skills from raiding the dungeons. Unfortunately, most of it was basic skills. He placed these skill books inside his house. He could sell these skill books if he doesn't have any money left in his pockets. The undead light spell that he acquired from his expedition in the Desolate Woods was in his house. He still hasn't learned it. He was still having a hard time building the spell structure manually, that's why he focused on the combat arts that he redeemed in the past 2 months. There's still time before version 2. He guessed that he would be able to reach level 30 plus before the start of version 2. Maybe, midway of the 30s, and if he focused on leveling up he could probably reach the peak of his 2nd evolution. He will focus on his 3rd evolution when version 2 starts. He also has a plan to go back to the Undead Sanctuary when he reached his 3rd evolution. It's true that he got the Soul Blood earring there in the sanctuary, but that's not all the treasure that can be found there. There were orange and red grade equipments in the middle level and high level dungeons in the sanctuary. Also, skill books and some high level potion that could drastically increase his stats. He also began to wonder why a universal treasure such as Soul Blood earring was inside one of the low level dungeons in the sanctuary, and there's no treasure in the boss room of the high level dungeon in the sanctuary. All they could see there was a huge metal door. A lot of players tried to open it before but no one managed to do it. They also made a hole at the side of the door and looked at the place behind the door. What they found was nothing. Yeah, nothing. It was as if the door was stuck there. Souta shook his head and put those thoughts in the back of his head. He will eventually know it when the time comes. In the future, he will go back there in the Undead Sanctuary. He looked at Bargain who was saying something in front of the class. Okay, class. Dismiss. Bargain said as he picked up the book on the table and exited the classroom. Souta exclaimed. He looked around with a surprised expression only to find that everyone was packing their things, reading to leave the classroom. He got absorbed in his own thoughts that he forgot about time. He didn't think that the class would end just like that, and the only thing that he heard from the teacher was okay, class. Dismiss. Let's go, Souta. Souta heard a voice from his side. He looked over and saw that Brian was calling him. He forgot that he will go to Lamilia's apartment to visit cl.u.s.ter with Brian. Oh okay. Souta nodded at Brian and then he stood up. He looked at Alice who was beside him and said, well, I'll go now. See you, tomorrow. Okay. Alice looked up at him and replied to his words. Souta nodded and he exited the classroom with Brian. Alice looked at his figure and wondered what's up with these human and Demi. Is this really the right decision? She muttered in a low voice. She recalled the things that happened before she arrived on this continent. It was really tragic as a lot of people died because of her. Sabas, you said that I should live a happy life in this land, but I wonder about that. Alice thought as she turned her head to look at the window. A lot of people died to make her happy, but the question is she really happy in her current life? She tried to isolate herself and live a normal life here on this continent. She encountered different types of people in this land, but she hasn't made a single friend. It was because she was unconsciously distancing herself from the people. Sabas, her guardian, also said before that she should make a lot of friends. But she didn't have a single friend here. No, 2 people came into her mind. These 2 were Souta Ishii and Brian Dagruel. These 2 people were the same yet different at the same time. Brian Dagruel was a man with the potential to become a powerhouse in the future. Even in her place, a person with 4 affinities was pretty rare. He was noisy and stubborn man. He also treats everyone as his friend, including Alice. He's an adventurer and he always sleeps in class when he did some difficulty quest. He rarely skips class. Souta was a mysterious man in her opinion. He's a demi, but she couldn't guess if he's a beastkin, elves, dwarves, etc. She doesn't have an idea about it. He was strange and have a vibe of a veteran warrior if he's serious. He was also an adventurer like Brian. Also, that sword of his was not an ordinary one. Alice could feel that it was higher than her orange-grade weapon. There's one more thing about him that she wanted to know. His last name Ishii. She wanted to know who are his parents and what his connection to that ancient clan. The knowledge about the ancient clans in this continent was close to nothing. The Institute didn't have a single information about it. Fortunately, her family has a long history and it was included in the history of the Great War a long time ago, so it preserved some of the information of the Great War. When she thought about these two people, her mouth subconsciously curved into a smile. It's not that bad, she said in a low voice. Souta and Brian were walking towards Lumilia's apartment. Today, they were going to visit cl.u.s.ter. Souta actually changed his mind. He doesn't want to visit cl.u.s.ter with his current condition. He just wanted to lie down on his bed and rest for a whole day. It was tiring to fight a lot of first-year students at the same time. How did you receive that injury? Brian asked while looking at his left hand, which was covered in bandages. There were strong people from other classes, so I fought them and naturally received an injury when I was fighting them alone. Souta lifted up his left hand and explained it to Brian. He then looked at Brian and said, by the way, I heard from George that you fought the top 10 ranker and won. Yeah, that guy was crazy strong. I wanted to fight him again. Brian said with a smile as he clenched his fist tightly. He was eager to fight another strong opponent. Brian's improvement is faster than I could imagine. Souta thought. Brian's improvement was a big surprise to him. Although, he already guessed it before, it still surprised him when he actually saw it. If he didn't have a system, maybe Brian would surpass him easily. This man, Brian Dagruel, has 4 affinities, and if he utilized it perfectly, then, in the near future, he would become one of the powerhouses. But there's something bothering him. And that's he couldn't remember Brian's name in the game. There's no doubt about this that Brian wasn't in the game. Or Brian died before he became a powerhouse. Brian's backstory, Souta wanted to know it, and so the quest about it. That's the most important thing, the quest that he will give. Chapter 103, Visiting cl.u.s.ter 1. A middle-aged man with short white hair and beard. He had white fox ears and tails. He was the principal of the Ladro Institute, Azrim. Standing in front of him was Bargain and the other teachers of the first year. Azrim looked at them and opened his mouth. So how is it? He asked. Bargain stepped forward and placed a stock of paper files on the table in front of Azrim. Another unusual student showed unbelievable strength, Bargain said. Azrim looked at it, the paper files, and picked one file. He read it before he looked at Bargain. Souta Ishii? He's from your class. What can you say about him? He's like Yanagi Shina when she first showed here in our institute. He dominated the special test and fought several rankers at the same time. Bargain replied to Azrim. He fought several rankers at the same time? If it's true, then he's like her. Fighting several rankers of the first year and could still win. Azrim rubbed his beard. He smiled and added, the next special test is not limited to year level. It will become a fight between the lower year and higher year. If he still dominated the second year, then he's really like her. Azrim then looked at the other teachers and asked, what can you say about him? Jess, the teacher of the sword class 1A, stepped forward and said, just like what Bargain said, that Souta is really like Yanagi. He is also brutal to his opponent and didn't have any hesitation to do it. Yanagi Shina was the current top 1 ranker in the whole institute. It means that she was the strongest student here. She enrolled in the institute 2 years ago. Back then, she also didn't show interest towards the ranking battles. Her rank back then was lower than Souta. But in the special test, she showed her power. She brutally beat the rankers alone. It was then that her name shook the entire institute. Since then, she showed an interest in the second-year students. She challenged them and brutally beat those senior of hers. She even caused some of the students to drop out of the institute because of fear towards her. She continued to grow stronger and beat everyone until she becomes the top 1 ranker of the whole institute. A lot of students feared her and isolated her because of this. In the grand tournament, she showed her overwhelming power in front of the whole kingdom and beat the students from other schools, academy, and institute. After that, various nobles proposed marriage to her, even the 5th prince of the kingdom wanted to take her hand. But the thing that happened next was out of everyone's expectations. She brutally beat those people, including the prince. Even with that incident, no one dared to take revenge against her. It was because she's the most precious student of the Ladro Institute. The Ladro Institute valued its students the most, and it wouldn't let any outside force interfere with the life of their students. It was especially the case to those people who were in the top ranker. They were protected by the institute. It was then that she was called the strongest student of Lodro Institute in history. I understand. Azrim nodded, then he asked, do you have the orb of the battle? Yes, it's here. Bargain nodded and placed a palm-sized black orb on the table. Azrim took the black orb and looked at it for a while. After a few seconds, he placed it down and asked, what about his background? Still unknown. We don't know where he came from. Bargain replied. Just like Yanagi, huh? Azrim said as he rubbed his beard. One of the teachers stepped forward and said, Principal, Yanagi Shina, snuck in the special test area to watch the first year. That happened. Azrim looked at the teacher that said those words. Yes, Principal. I saw it too. It seems that she's interested in one of the first-year students. Jess also said. That girl. Azrim sighed and he rubbed his temples. That girl is at it again, and who's the fortunate individual? I can't think of a person that fitted her. Jess said. I think that it's Souta, Bargain said. Really? Jess looked at Bargain with a surprised expression. Yeah, I saw her in the mini-tournament watching Souta's match. Bargain looked at Jess and said. If that's true, then it will become a problem. Azrim turned around, looked at the window. His strength is currently not enough to defend against her, so I want you all to use anything that you have to stop Yanagi in case she take action. Yes. Bargain and the rest of the teachers nodded their heads at his words. They wouldn't let Yanagi approach Souta this soon. They don't want him to meet the same ends as those people. He showed potential and they wouldn't let her break him. Azrim nodded and took another paper file. He looked at it and he opened his mouth. Randolphine? Another one from your class? What about him? He defeated the top 3 ranker with 1 strike. His current strength is still unknown to us. But I could say that he's as strong as Souta or maybe stronger than him. Bargain said. Another one. Azrim nodded and looked at the picture of Randolph in the paper file. Souta and Brian arrived in front of Lumilia's apartment. Hello, Lumilia. Brian said while knocking on the door. Lumilia went home first. She didn't go together with Souta and Brian because she said that she wanted to clean her room first. Souta thought that it was natural, so he agreed to her without hesitation. If he's coming to her apartment, it's natural that she should clean it first before she let him inside. I'm coming. A voice of a girl sounded beside the door. The girl sounded happy and excited at the same time. Souta and Brian looked at each other. They were familiar to this voice, so they instantly guessed the owner of the voice. After a few moments, they heard the sound of unlocking the door and it slowly opened. From inside, a small girl peeked outside. When the girl saw Souta and Brian, she flashed a bright smile. Brother Souta and brother Brian. She sounded happy at first, but it changed when she saw their wounds. What happened? Brian was about to say something when CL.U.S.Tur quickly rushed inside the room saying, Sister Mila. Brother Brian and brother Souta are injured. She's just surprised. Souta smiled at this and he opened the door. He removed his shoes and went inside the room. Oh, okay. Brian nodded and he also removed his shoes before he entered the room. The two of them grew closer to CL.U.S.Tur because almost every day the two of them visited her in the past 2 months. Although they got closer, Souta could feel that she was still hiding something from him. And that was her background. Lumilia walked out of her room and saw that Souta and Brian were already inside. She was wearing casual clothes and not her usual uniform. Look, Sister Mila, brother Brian and brother Souta are injured. CL.U.S.Tur said as she pointed her finger at Souta and Brian's injury. You're talking about this? Souta smiled and he lifted up his left hand, which was covered in bandages. I fought a lot of strong people in the institute. We needed to defeat a lot of people in our special test, so I have to fight them. That's right, it was exciting. Brian said with a hint of excitement in his voice. I wanted to fight them again. Then, why isn't Sister Mila injured? CL.U.S.Tur tilted her head slightly and asked. Brian looked at Lumilia and wondered why she wasn't injured. Souta looked at CL.U.S.Tur and said, it's simple. Do you want to know? Yes, yes. CL.U.S.Tur nodded her head. Yeah. Brian also nodded his head. It's because she's weak. I protected her in the special test. I defeated a lot of strong people so that those people wouldn't come to her. Souta said with a smile on his face. He then looked at Lumilia. Right. Lumilia's mouth twitched when she heard this. She wanted to rebut, but she remembered that Souta was powerful and her strength was nothing to him, so she shut her mouth. Is that right? Brian looked at Lumilia and asked with confusion. He thought that Lumilia was strong because she's the leader of the class. No, that's not it. Don't listen to what he says. Lumilia sighed and said. She then turned around and went into the kitchen. What do you want? Tea or coffee? Tea. CL.U.S.Ter said as she lifted up her hand. Tea. Brian said as he raised his hand above his head. Coffee. Souta said as he stood up and patted his clothes. He followed Lamilia in the kitchen while thinking about something that happened in the special test. Chapter 104, Visiting CL.U.S.Ter 2. Souta stood up and looked at Brian. Play with CL.U.S.Ter for a while, I will ask class rep some things regarding the special test this morning. What is it? Brian asked. You're in the collecting group before so you don't know what happened at the campsite, Souta said. Oh, right. I forgot about that. Brian said then he looked at CL.U.S.Ter with a big smile on his face. What do you want to play, CL.U.S.Ter? Today this brother of yours will accompany you. Souta nodded in satisfaction. He then went inside the kitchen. There, he saw Lamilia was preparing their tea and coffee. Class rep, Souta called her as he approached her. Lamilia looked behind when she heard someone called her. She saw Souta walking towards her. Is there something wrong? Do you want to change your drink to tea? Coffee is fine, Souta said as he looked at the coffee that she was preparing. He closed his eyes and smelled the aroma of the coffee. That's good. Then, do you have something that you wanted to ask me? Lamilia said while looking at Souta. This was the only reason she could think of why Souta followed her in the kitchen. Can you tell me what happened at the campsite on the special test? Since she said so, Souta decided to ask her directly. That. You're the reason why our class score was the highest. I'm thankful for your effort on behalf of our class. Lamilia thanked him sincerely. She always wanted her class to defeat the other class and become the number one class, in that way she and her classmates would receive a lot of points. With this, they would be able to increase their combat power by redeeming various skills from the Institute. She wanted to get into top rankers because she wanted the protection of the Institute. Don't worry about it, Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder. Then, can you tell me what happened at the campsite while I was away? There's a lot of things that happened at the campsite. So what do you want to know? Lamilia said and asked him about the specific details. As a class rep and the one who's commanding the class, she was aware that a lot of battles happened at their campsite. Souta rubbed his chin and said, then, what happened to the top 3 ranker Yuriko? Explain to me everything. That. Lamilia was surprised but she immediately regained her composure. She knew that it was strange that they managed to repeal the top 3 ranker along with her comrades. She thought that Souta saw Yuriko in their campsite and their red flag, so he must be wondering how did they manage to defend the red flag against her. Yuriko, the top 3 ranker, appeared in our campsite along with her comrades after you left. She began to narrate what really happened at the campsite. At first, Yujin tried to stop Yuriko. It was a plan to defeat Yuriko's comrade while Yujin was fighting her. But the problem was Yuriko was stronger than they could imagine. She defeated Yujin in just a few minutes and someone unexpected appeared before them. It was Randolphine. Randolph showed his overwhelming power and defeated Yuriko in one strike. Randolph did that. Souta couldn't believe what he heard from Lamilia's mouth. Randolph defeated Yuriko in one strike? That sort of thing happened at the campsite. Yeah, everyone was shocked too when they saw it, Lamilia said as if she still couldn't believe that a seemingly delinquent classmate of her defeated the top 3 ranker. That man. Souta muttered as he rubbed his chin. It seems that there were still students who didn't bother in showing their true power. He needed to be wary of Randolph as he doesn't have any idea how powerful he is. He wondered if he would probe him or not in the future. Well, it all depends if he showed that he's a dangerous individual. In the game, he couldn't recall any person that resembles Randolph. Okay. Souta nodded at her and he went back to Brian and CL.U.S.Ter. Lamilia turned her head and looked at Souta's figure. I want to play with Yuko, brother Souta. CL.U.S.Ter said to him as soon as he arrived. Souta looked at her then at Brian. She said that she wanted to play with Yuko, Brian said with a wry smile. Okay, let's ask class rep. Souta smiled and said. There's no harm if he lets CL.U.S.Ter play with Yuko. Also, he forgot to buy some cake for CL.U.S.Ter. They could go to the market on their way to his house. Souta, CL.U.S.Ter, and Brian talked for a while before Lamilia came. She brought the coffee and tea that she prepared. She gave the coffee to Souta and tea to CL.U.S.Ter and Brian. Brian and CL.U.S.Ter took their tea and took a sip at the same time. Souta smelled the aroma of his coffee before he took a sip of it. It's good as usual. He commented. Even though Lamilia was a noble, she still knew how to brew good coffee and handle her daily necessities well. If it's other nobles, then they would only depend on their servant in things like this. He opened his eyes and looked at Lumilia. Class rep, we're going to bring CL.U.S.Tur in my house. She wanted to play with Yuko. Lumilia looked at the CL.U.S.Tur who has a bright smile on her face before she nodded her head. Okay, I will come along too. You sure? Souta asked as he knew that Lumilia hasn't been to his house. When he brought CL.U.S.Tur to his house to play with Yuko before, Lumilia didn't come along with him. Only Brian and CL.U.S.Tur knew the location of his house. Yeah. Lumilia nodded at him. Ha ha ha, don't be surprised if you see Souta's house. Brian laughed at the side. Yeah, brother, Souta's house is huge. CL.U.S.Tur said with a laugh. Souta just smiled and he didn't deny it because it's true. His house was big and it cost him a lot of his money that he got from selling the monster orb to Jimmy. Lumilia looked at Souta and she didn't saw him deny it or agreeing to it, so she thought that it was true. After they finished their drinks, the group went out of Lumilia's apartment. Yay! We're going to Yuko. CL.U.S.Tur exclaimed while hopping in a happy manner. Souta glanced at her and thought that she was nowhere close to the CL.U.S.Tur that they first met. At that time, CL.U.S.Tur was silent and shy. She rarely talked to him and Brian. But now, she could smile like that in front of him. We're going to the market first, CL.U.S.Tur, Brian said with an excited expression. It looks like he was the child here other than CL.U.S.Tur. Really? CL.U.S.Tur looked at Brian with sparkling eyes. Yeah. Souta will buy anything that you like. Brian assured her that Souta will buy anything for her. Why me? Souta heard his name being mentioned by Brian, so he asked. It's because you're rich. A rich man. Brian said with a confident expression. The hell is that? Class rep is a noble, so why don't you ask her? Souta said as he glanced at Lumilia, who didn't say anything. Well, her house is small compared to yours, Brian replied to him as a matter of fact. Lumilia's mouth twitched when she heard Brian's words. So that's the reason why you think that I have more money than her, Souta said while nodding his head. Yeah, is it wrong? Brian looked at him and asked. Nope, you're correct. Souta simply nodded his head. The corner of Lumilia's mouth once again twitched when she heard Souta's words. Souta looked at her and asked, What's wrong, class rep? I'm just wondering how rich you are. Lumilia smiled and said. She knew that Souta was just teasing him, so she decided to go along with him to avoid it. You can't fathom it with that mind of yours, Souta said with a smirk, and he crossed his arms in front of him. Lumilia wanted to say something, but she decided to stay silent as her decision to go along with him was wrong. After walking for a few minutes, Souta, Lumilia, CL.U.S.Tur, and Brian arrived in the market. Whoa! I want this, Souta! Brian exclaimed as he pointed at the shining green gem in the stall. What, are you a child? Souta said to him. Whoa! I want this, brother Souta! CL.U.S.Tur exclaimed while pointing at the strawberry cake. Okay, how much it is? Souta nodded and he walked towards her. He took out her wallet and asked the salesman. 5 copper coins, sir. The salesman replied to him. Okay, I'll take 3 of it. Souta nodded and took out 1 silver coin. Suddenly, he heard a voice coming from his side. Chapter 105, Visitors. Souta heard someone called his name. He looked over and saw a man with huge build. He has short brown hair and sky blue eyes. He was Brando Hilot from the Shield Class 1A. Oh! Brando! How are you? Souta greeted Brando with a smile. I'm fine. How about you? Brando replied as he walked towards Souta. He noticed that Souta was with Brian, Lumilia, and a little girl. I'm fine, Souta said, and he turned his attention to the salesman. He received the paper bag that contained the strawberry cakes. Brando had many bruises in his body. After all, Souta defeated him before in the special test. Hello, Brian and Asvers. Brando greeted Brian and Lumilia, then he looked at the little girl with long green hair. He wondered who's this little girl. CL.U.S.Tur hid behind Lumilia and carefully looked at Brando. Since she didn't know him, she was shy and wary at the same time. Brian smiled at this and said, She's CL.U.S.Tur. We're taking care of her. I see. Brando nodded his head in understanding. Souta, who finished buying the strawberry cakes, joined the conversation. How's your injury? He asked Brando. Brando looked at the bruises on his body before he replied, It's okay, the healers from the institute healed most of the heavy injuries in my body, leaving only the bruises. That's great, Souta said. Do you have something to do? Brian asked Brando. Nothing, why? Brando replied to him as he slightly tilted his head. Then, do you want to join us? Actually, we're going to Souta's house. Brian asked Brando even though it wasn't his house. Brando looked at Souta and asked, "Is that okay?" Souta pondered and thought that there's no harm if Brando was going to join them. He looked at Lamilia and asked, "Is that fine with you?" "It's okay, it's your house after all," Lamilia replied to him as she patted CL.U.S.'s head. "You heard her," Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder. "Thanks, then I will take your offer." Brando thanked them with a smile. Lamilia looked at Brando and never thought that Souta and Brian were his friends. He wasn't surprised that Brando was Brian's friend because most of their classmates were Brian's friend, but what surprised him was Souta. In the class, Souta would only talk to a few individuals and it's pretty rare if he would talk to someone else besides Alice and Brian. It's already rare that Souta would talk to someone in their class, then what about the other classes? Souta and Brian knew Brando well. Back in the ranking battles, Brian challenged Brando a lot as Brando defeated him in the mini-tournament before. While Brando challenged Souta in the battle for the same reason. Ever since then, the three of them became close and always talked when they met each other. Souta and the group went to the best shop to buy some fruits and honey for Yuko. He wouldn't forget something important. "Honestly, I got scared when Souta appeared in my class campsite," Brando said with a sigh. He knew from the ranking battles that Souta was many times stronger than him, that's why he trained harder for the past months. He wasn't prepared to fight Souta in the special test, so he's planning to avoid their class at all cost, but who would have thought that Souta was going to appear in front of their campsite? "Haha, that's nothing." Souta laughed lightly. "It's okay if it was only Brian but you Souta. It was a different matter." Brando sighed helplessly as his shoulder dropped down. He wanted to get stronger not just for himself but for his class too. A lot of people were ridiculing his class saying that they were not fitted to become a Class 1A. Their class was the weakest among all of Class A in the institute. "Ha, so you're telling me that you can handle me," Brian said as he smiled deviously. "Of course, if it's you I still have a chance." Brando didn't back down. "Haha, then let's fight and see if you can do it." Brian laughed. "Stop it, you two. Both of you know that you can't win against me," Souta said as he walked between them. Lamilia just simply listened to their conversation. CL.U.S. was sticking close to her as there's a new face in their group. Suddenly, Souta stopped walking as he felt the presence of someone following him. Souta quietly looked around his surroundings. He tried to guess who's following him. "What's wrong, Souta?" Lamilia asked him when he suddenly stopped walking. Brian and Brando too looked at him with a questioning gaze. Souta looked at them and he took a deep breath. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "Don't be surprised about what I'm going to say." Lamilia, Brian, and Brando nodded at him. They noticed his serious expression, so they thought that what he's going to say next was important. "Follow me, I'll tell you while walking," Souta said in a low voice and he started to walk. Lamilia held CL.U.S. in her arms as she followed Souta closely. Brian and Brando followed him closely so that they could hear what he's going to say. After a few moments, Souta opened his mouth and said in a low voice, "Someone is following us." Lamilia frowned when she heard his words. She looked down at CL.U.S. with a worried expression. She then asked, "How many?" "5 or more," Souta said to them. That many people are following us but I still couldn't notice them. It means that they have some skills. I want to fight them." Brian commented and grinned widely. "I felt that they are powerful. With skill like this, I think you wouldn't stand a chance against them," Souta said. "Is this true, Souta?" Brando asked from the side. "Yeah, I think it would be good if you go now," Souta said to Brando. "I will stay here. I'll gladly help a fellow schoolmate of mine." Brando replied to Souta. "Oh. Then, thanks." Souta was surprised at Brando's words. To think that Brando would choose to stay here despite knowing that someone was following them. It seems that he needed to place Brando in the bracket of a good guy. "Let's go here." Souta went inside the restaurant. He thought that if he went inside the place where a lot of people stay those people wouldn't show themselves. Also, if someone went inside this place, Souta would be able to mark them and remember their face. Lamilia, CL.U.S. Brian, and Brando just nodded their head and followed Souta with asking any questions. Souta was the strongest among them and he knew how to handle this kind of situation, so they followed him like a leader. Also, Lamilia and Brian would follow him and know that he wouldn't bring them any harm from their experience in the desolate forest. Souta's group went to the second floor of the restaurant and there they sat in the vacant table. No one said anything and they sat in their seat. Souta rubbed his chin and he looked outside the window. He wondered why someone was following them and he wanted to know what's their purpose. He couldn't clearly determine their number as some of them were quite skilled in stealth. If not for his good intuition, he wouldn't be able to notice that someone was following him. If these people were following them then they clearly have a target. Souta guessed that it was CL.U.S.Ter. He thought that the people who were after CL.U.S.Ter found her. It's not that surprising as Souta didn't bother himself in disguising her. It was only a possibility. He wasn't sure if she's really the target. There's only one thing that he was sure, and that's these people were quite strong. Souta noticed that something was wrong. There's no waiter that asked them about their order even when they were just sitting here for a while now. He turned around and saw two people wearing black cloaks in front of them. Brian and Brando immediately stood up and put up their guard when they saw this. A commotion started, so the people in the other tables turned their heads to watch them. They all looked at the two people wearing black cloaks and Souta's group who were facing them. Souta was still sitting in the chair while observing the two people. The person on the right side was grinning and his presence wasn't that much, but the problem was the person on the left side. The person on the left side doesn't have any presence at all. If Souta weren't going to focus his senses, then he would be able to sense the man's mana. This man could hide his mana this well. Compared to the other one, this one is more dangerous. Souta thought, and he focused his eyes on that person. Then, the person on the right side lifted up his hands. He pulled down his hood and revealed his face to the rest. Souta saw the man's face and was surprised. He smiled and said, "I should have killed you at that time. Well, I won't let you go this time." He suddenly pulled out the Vajra sword Saya on his waist and used Crimson Moon skill immediately. Chapter 106, Assassins. The man pulled down his hood and revealed his face to the rest. He smiled and said, "Long time no see, brat." Brian and Souta revealed a surprised expression as both of them knew this man. Souta smiled and said, "I should have killed you at that time. Well, I won't let you go this time." He then quickly grabbed the handle of the Vajra sword and pulled it out. He used the Crimson Moon skill. Brian quickly reacted as he went beside Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter. He took the two away as he knew that Souta was going to fight here in this place. Brando was stunned as he doesn't know what's happening. He didn't even know who's this man and had no idea what's their relationship. The other man pulled out a dagger and quickly stepped forward in front of his comrade. He raised his dagger and blocked Souta's attack. The man managed to block his attack, so Souta quickly turned to Brando and shouted, "Brando, protect them, you're a shielder, right? Then, it's your job to protect them." Brando nodded and went beside Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter. Lumilia took CL.U.S.Ter in her arms as she took a distance and cast defensive spell. Brian knew what to do in this kind of situation. Since Souta asked Brando to protect the rest, he had to fight now. Souta once again used Crimson Moon, but his attack was blocked by the man once again. Damn. Souta cursed as he gathered his mana and cast Agility Boost, and Strength Boost. He narrowed his eyes as he observed the two figures in front of him. The man who blocked his attack was wearing a black cloak. His figure was muscular and his feature was sharp with a scar on his right eye. He was armed with a sharp dagger and Souta guessed that it was an orange-grade weapon. Souta knew the other man. That man was Vince, the knight that he fought before in the desolate woods. And now this man came to kill them. He then heard a sound in his head. Protect Lumilia from the assassin that came to take her life. Time limit, 5 o'clock. Rewards, 20,000 EXP, 6 free attribute points, and 3 skill points. So their target is class rep, not CL.U.S.Ter. Souta thought. He knew that Lumilia's apartment was protected by Institute, so these assassins couldn't enter there easily. They must have thought that this was a chance since only he, Brian, and Brando was here. Also, they wouldn't be able to fight well because of their injuries. This is getting bad, Souta muttered in a low voice. He accepted the quest without hesitation. Well, it's class rep he was talking about. One of the customers here stood and approached them. He was going to say something when his head flew in the air. His blood spurted out like a fountain. The whole place turned quiet as no one dared to utter a single word. In the next moment, their face was painted with fear and they screamed loudly. Fear consumed their hearts as they started to panic. Help! Brando and Brian opened their eyes widely at this scene. Lumilia covered CL.U.S.Ter's eyes with her hands. She doesn't want her to see the scene. The man with the dagger looked at them with an annoyed expression. He opened his mouth and said, "So noisy." He then waved the dagger and blue light swept out towards the other customers. Suddenly, Brian appeared in front of them and cast defensive spell. He wasn't going to let other people die. Souta glanced at Brian, then he used cat speed and triple muscle strengthening. He then dashed towards the man with the dagger. Souta slashed his sword several times but the man simply parried all of his attacks. An assassin attacking his target openly, are you an amateur or not? Souta mocked the man while slashing his sword. Don't worry, all of you will die here. The man said while blocking Souta's attack. Souta frowned as he felt his wounds opening up. This was really not a good situation for him. He just fought this morning, so his stamina and mana haven't recovered yet. The man blocked his sword and quickly launched a powerful punch. Souta moved his body and he managed to avoid the punch. He then saw the man stomped his feet on the floor. Crack. The floor cracked before it collapsed. Damn. Souta found himself falling on the first floor. He adjusted his body and used airwalk. In just a second, he arrived on the second floor and clashed again with the man with the scar on his face. Vince was surprised and thought that they would be able to kill Souta quickly. He didn't think that Souta would grow this powerful in just 2 months. He shook his head and looked at Lumilia, their target. After he survived in the calamity, he didn't go back to Melosa country immediately. He first rested in the Dry Gulch town and saw Souta's group there. He observed them and found that Lumilia was a noble of an opposing country and Souta was her guard at that time. He then went back to his country. He reported what happened there and his lord was enraged. They lost a lot of people there and wanted to take revenge, so they hired an assassin to kill the opposing people, and that's Lumilia. Even though Lumilia wasn't the culprit of the calamity, she was still there. Lumilia's group prevented everyone from taking the mystical light cherry. Vince's group didn't even manage to bring out some benefits in the desolate woods, but instead, they suffered heavy casualties. His lord just wanted to vent his anger. All the other things were just an excuse. It's all their fault. Yeah, it's all their fault. Vince muttered to himself while looking at Lumilia. Several figures broke the window and entered the second floor. They were all wearing black cloaks. They stood up and looked at everyone. One of the figures stepped forward and said, "Kill everyone here immediately. The city guard will arrive in this place soon." Brando activated all of his combat arts that could increase his strength. He knew that he wasn't strong, and if one of these people could match Souta, then he was sure that he couldn't handle them alone. Suddenly, a figure flew and crashed in the pillar of the room. It shook the whole area and cracks started to spread around. Brando looked at it and was surprised when he saw that it was Souta. "Brother Souta." CL.U.S.Ter shouted worriedly. "Ouch." Souta groaned in pain as he wound a mouthful of blood. He stood up and patted his clothes. These people were too strong for his current condition. If he wasn't injured in the first place, then he would be able to put up a decent fight. He looked at his mana and saw that he could only cast his spell 7 more times. His stamina wasn't going to last too. The hell with this. There are 5 more assassins. Souta cursed when he saw another 5 people wearing black cloaks. He glanced at Lumilia's group and at his opponents. He assessed that they were at a disadvantage in number and also in strength. "There's no choice but to do this," Souta muttered as he cast Shadow Bind spell. He then circulated his mana around his body. The black figures quickly moved their body and dodged the shadows that were trying to bind them. He then used Cross Moon to destroy all the pillars of the room. "Brando. Protect class rep and CL.U.S.Ter. Souta shouted at them. "What about Brian and the other people?" Brando replied to him. "We don't have time to worry about them," Souta said as the ceiling collapsed. Debris of rocks fell down and crashed the ground. Some of the rocks crushed the customers into meat paste. The black figures immediately jumped out of the window while Vince and the man with the scar on his right eye cast defensive spell as they were far from the window. "Damn. That brat." Vince cursed as he looked at Souta. Souta looked down and he slashed the floor beneath him. He jumped down on the first floor. He doesn't care about the other people in this restaurant. As long as they survive, it's okay for him. Souta wasn't worried about Brian as he knew that guy has some sort of luck in this kind of situation. He guessed that he will found Brian later who miraculously survived. He landed on the first floor and he also destroyed the pillars. He wanted this whole building to fall down and it will give him some time. But the black figures who went outside through the window saw him. 2 of them immediately went inside the first floor and threw a powerful punch at Souta. Souta tried to block the punch, but the enemies were faster than him even with all of his buffs. Arg. Souta flew and crashed in the wall. He was gasping as the bandage on his left hand was now blood red in color. "Damn. This is bad. The special test this morning drained my mana and stamina." He cursed in his mind. His hands were trembling and sweat kept pouring. His vision was getting blurred. "Do you want me to kill them for you? Just let me borrow your body." A sweet voice sounded in his mind. Souta knew that it was the Vajra sword Saya. The 2 figures slowly approached him. "Okay, I'll let you borrow my body." Souta lifted up his head with great effort. He looked at these people with a smile, but the next second his smile turned stiff because of the Vajra sword Saya. "I've changed my mind, you fufu." The Vajra sword Saya laughed in his mind. "You kidding me, right?" Souta looked at the 2 figures who arrived in front of him. "Just die." The 2 figures took out daggers in both of their hands before they raised it above their heads. Souta closed his eyes and cursed the Vajra sword in his mind. He saw a red figure in his mind laughing at him. "Damn. UF.U.C.K.I.N.G sword. But after a few seconds, he still hasn't felt anything. He opened his eyes and saw the two figures didn't have their heads anymore. Their heads fell down and rolled on the ground. Their eyes were widely opened as they couldn't believe that they died. Ah, no one could kill him in my presence, only I could do that. A feminine voice sounded. Souta saw a woman approached him. The woman arrived in front of him and held his cheeks. Ah, you're amazing, marvelous, wonderful, incredible. Ah, I love you. I like you. I want you to myself, but you're still not ripe. I'll let you go for now. But after this, in the next test, I will crush you. Chapter 107, The Appearance of the Most Powerful Student. Who is this girl? Souta thought while looking at her. The girl has long lilac-colored hair that was tied in a ponytail at the back of her head. Her eyes have different colors. Her left eye was blue in color while the other one was crimson red. She's wearing the uniform of the Ladro Institute. Her bust wasn't big nor small, it's a normal size. Her skin was smooth and as white as snow. She was beautiful, more than any woman that Souta saw. Whoa. It's my first time seeing these eyes. Souta was amazed when he saw her eyes. He then recalled what she said before and shivered. He opened his mouth and said, what did you say? Ah, you didn't hear it clearly. Okay, I will repeat it for you. The woman placed her mouth near his ear and said, I love you. I want you to myself. Even now, I'm holding myself for taking you. I know, you're still not ripe. Ha? That's not what you said before. Souta frowned as he looked at her. There's something wrong in her head. He thought when he heard her words. Yufufu, it seems that you are listening to me. I like it. The girl flashed a seductive smile at him. Anyways, help me stand, Souta said as his body was embedded deep in the walls. He couldn't move well because of his injuries and tiredness. Since this girl was wearing the uniform of Ladro Institute, he thought that she was here to help her fellow students. I don't want to. The girl said as she just looked at him without doing anything. Souta was stunned. He was about to say something when the ceiling above them collapsed. But don't worry, I won't let anyone get you. I will kill those people that dared to hurt you. Only I could do that. Ah. I won't let anyone. Those rights are mine. At the end of her sentence, her tone changed, and her breathing speeds up. Damn. This girl is bad news. Souta cursed in his mind and wondered who this girl is. Umph. The girl looked up and her magical power exploded. Her aura swept the debris of rocks that were falling. Souta was shocked when he saw this. He started to think if this girl was really just a student. Her power wasn't something a student could possess. Just who the hell is this crazy girl? The fall of the building naturally caused a commotion. The people in the vicinity looked at this curiously and wondered what happened that caused this building to fall. What happened here? I don't know. I just heard a loud explosion and when I looked the building was falling. Let's call the city guard. They will handle this kind of thing. The people around started whispering to each other. Then, they saw three people wearing black cloaks walk towards the site. The man in the center looked around and saw two people in the center. A man and a woman. He didn't know the girl but the man, he knew him well. Their employee said that it's one of their targets. So he's still alive. He muttered in a low voice. He glanced at his surroundings and decided to finish this quickly before the city guard arrived here. Suddenly, a man burst out of the debris of rocks. The man has short spiky black hair and black eyes. He was Brian Dagruel. Oh, I thought I would die, Brian said as he wiped the blood on his forehead. He looked around him and saw Souta with a girl that he didn't know. Souta, what are you doing? He opened his mouth and asked Souta. Souta lifted up his head and looked at Brian. Oh. Brian, you're still alive. Of course, I wouldn't die easily. Brian smiled and said. He then looked at the girl in front of Souta and asked, by the way, who's that girl? She. Souta glanced at the girl in front of him and shook his head. I don't have any idea who she is but I think she's our ally this time. The girl glanced at Brian before she turned to Souta. She slowly opened her mouth and said, Yufufu, not ours but yours. Damn. This crazy girl. Where the hell did she pop out? Souta cursed inside his mind. He didn't let it show on his face. He just simply smiled while looking at her. He. Yufufu. The girl also smiled while looking at him. Okay, I'll ignore her for now. Souta thought as he closed his eyes. He doesn't want to look at her for now. At this time, Brando and Lumilia emerged from the debris of rocks with CL.U.S.Tur. Both of them were covered in bruises as they protected CL.U.S.Tur from harm. Are you okay, CL.U.S.Tur? Lumilia looked at CL.U.S.Tur and she gently asked. Yes, I'm fine but you and brother. CL.U.S.Ter said as she looked at Lamilia and Brando who protected her. Don't worry about us. We're fine. Lamilia smiled and she patted CL.U.S.Ter's head. Yeah, don't worry. We're going to protect you. Brando said as he flashed a bright smile to CL.U.S.Ter. He then looked around with a frown on his face. They survived, but the other customers in this place weren't as lucky as them. Just who the hell are those people? He thought. Vince and the man with the scar on his face emerged from the ground. That F.U.C.K.I.N.G brat. Vince cursed loudly while holding his head. He felt pain on his head as a huge rock fell on it before. Where the F.U.C.K is he? The man with the scar on his face gritted his teeth in anger. The people wearing black cloaks were stunned when they saw that Souta's group survived without a single casualty. The man that looked like the leader gritted his teeth. He opened his mouth and shouted, "Kill them all, we need to finish them. We can't afford to fail this." Yes. All of them pulled out their sword. Suddenly, the woman beside Souta appeared in front of him. The man was surprised when he saw this. He couldn't understand how this girl appeared in front of him. She was so fast that he couldn't even saw her moved. "I've heard it, you know. You wanted to kill my precious Sue. I can't handle it anymore. Just saying his name, makes me." The girl said in a strange tone. Then, she stretched out her hand to grab the man, but the man jumped backward. "What the hell is this girl?" The man said while looking at the girl. "You. I'll smash, crush, break, and destroy you, ugly bastard." The girl shouted and her mana burst out of her body. Her release of power shook the entire ground and a powerful gust of wind swept out in the whole area. Her aura suppressed every person in the vicinity. It was so powerful that weak people couldn't even breathe under her aura. Arg. The man that looked like the leader gritted his teeth as he tried to endure the pressure. The air around him was tightening. The pressure were focused on him and his comrades. He opened his mouth and said, "Let's abort the mission. Let's find another opportunity." They thought that it would be an easy mission as Souta and the other were injured, but who would have thought that this girl would appear out of nowhere and help Souta's group? "Umph. You will not get away." The girl snorted and waved her hand. It was followed by a dense mana that swept everything out. It was so dense that people could see it with their own eyes. The dense mana swallowed the people who were wearing black cloaks. Not just them, but the other people who were watching this got caught up in the aftermath. It caused several explosions in the area around them. It destroyed a few buildings and the people started to run in panic. Obviously, they don't want to die in this place. So powerful. Brando covered his eyes as he stood in front of Lamilia and CL.U.S.Ter. "Ah!" Brian shouted as the explosion swallowed him. He was close to the man with the scar on his face and Vince, so he got caught up in the explosion. Smoke and dust covered some parts of the destroyed buildings. The whole area was in ruins as more than 10 buildings were destroyed. "Damn. The crazy girl is powerful," Souta muttered while looking around him. He was safe and sound. Not even dust reached him despite the powerful explosions around him. The girl protected him well. Only him, as Brian's condition right now was unknown. Brando placed down his hand and looked at the girl with long lilac-colored hair. "Just who is this girl?" Lamilia looked at the girl and gulped. "I remember those features. That hair color, that eyes, and that face. There's no doubt about this." "Do you know her?" Brando asked. "Yeah, I think she's the current top 1 ranker of the whole institute. The one who dominated the grand tournament and beat the royal prince. The most powerful student of Lodro Institute in history. Yanagi Shina." Chapter 108, What a Tiring Day. Congratulations on completing the quest Protect. You've received 20,000 EXP, 6 free attribute points, and 3 skill points. Agility, Dexterity, Vitality, and Intelligence attributes have increased by 10. You've received 1 free skill point. Souta looked at the system prompts that he received. He already finished the quest since this unknown girl already killed all the assassins. But to think that not even 5 minutes have passed before the helper arrived. He also found that he levels up from the EXP that he received from this quest. He was level 24 right now and it will take a long time before he level up once again. After a few more levels, his level will reach the middle level of the version 2. Well, right now Souta has 11 skill points in total. It was enough to level up his Shadow Bind spell to level 10. If he does that, then he would be promoted to rank 2 mage. His strength would increase once again. Souta shook his head and put all these thoughts in the back of his mind. Right now, he wanted to go back to his house and rest. This day was pretty tiring even to him. He gritted his teeth and tried to move his body out of the walls. In the end, he didn't manage to get out of the walls. His body was still embedded deep in the walls. Damn. This is hard. Souta cursed as he loosened his muscles and lay there comfortably. He closed his eyes and cleared his mind. This is not bad. I'm sure the city guard will come here later. He muttered. He then heard a sound that someone was talking to each other. Opening his eyes, he found Lumilia, Brando, and CL.U.S.Ter. They were talking something while observing the unknown girl. These people are now comfortably talking to each other while I'm here stuck in the walls. Damn. After all the things I did to protect them. Souta thought while looking at the three of them. He opened his mouth and said, Oi. Can you guys help me get out of here? Lumilia, CL.U.S.Ter, and Brando turned their heads when they heard his voice. They found him stuck in the walls. Brother Souta. CL.U.S.Ter broke free from Lumilia's arms and rushed toward Souta with a concerned look on her face. Brando also rushed toward Souta when he saw his condition. It was worse than he imagined. CL.U.S.Ter arrived in front of Souta and tried to pull him out. Arg. Brother. I'll pull you out. She tried her best but she couldn't do it with her strength. I'll handle this, Brando said with a smile as he patted CL.U.S.Ter's head. Suddenly, a voice sounded beside his ears. What are you doing to Sue him? Brando was surprised when he heard this voice. He quickly turned around and saw Yanagi Shina behind him. Brando subconsciously took a step backward. He slowly opened his mouth and said, I am just helping my friend. He was nervous as he was talking to the number 1 student of the Ladro Institute. He didn't know why she was here but she helped them in this crisis. CL.U.S.Ter hid behind Brando when Yanagi appeared. She didn't know this woman, so she was quite wary of him. Actually, she was wary of Brando too but he saved her this time. Yanagi knitted her brows and said, Don't worry about him, I will take care of him. Souta who heard this opened his mouth, Oi. Brando, don't listen to her. Just help me get out of here. Brando didn't know what to do as Yanagi was emitting a fierce aura. He didn't know what she would do if he didn't follow her. He looked at Souta and said, I'm sorry, Souta. I will let her take care of you. Oi. I'm your friend, right? At least help me get out of here. Souta looked at Brando with wide eyes. Good. Yanagi looked at Brando and she flashed a beautiful smile at Brando. Miss Shina, what will you do to Souta? Brando carefully asked Yanagi. Don't call me that. Use lady when you're talking to me. Yanagi said with an annoyed tone. Only Souta can say my name directly. She said in a low voice that only she could hear. Okay, Lady Shina. Brando nodded at her. Shina. It feels familiar. Don't tell me she's Yanagi Shina. Souta thought and was stunned when he realized that this girl was Yanagi Shina of the Ladro Institute. Her appearance was different from what he knew in the game. In the game, Yanagi Shina was a famous NPC in this kingdom. She lost her left eye in the demon invasion and because of some unknown skill, her lilac-colored hair turned into silver color. Her appearance when he saw her in the game was really different when she was still in the Ladro Institute. The players of the Hebre kingdom called her Goddess of Hebre. She created her own group that only consists of a powerful woman. The king of the kingdom permitted her, so she led her group to roam around the kingdom to help kill the demons. In the end, she fell in the event where the Zodiac, one of the 3 bringers of calamity, attacked the whole continent. It was really tragic at that time when the Zodiac attacked the continent. Several large countries and kingdoms fell in that event. Even the 3 great countries suffered heavy casualties at that time. The Zodiac only have 12 members but each one of them possessed power rivaling that of a god. Souta stared at Yanagi Shina as he recalled what happened in the game. Souta and the rest heard several footsteps coming towards their direction. All of them turned their heads and saw people wearing silver plate armor and helmet. They were the city guards of Ladro City. The city guards looked at them before they approached them. They recognized Yanagi Shina as the most precious student of the Ladro Institute. What happened here, Lady Shina? The captain of the squad asked Yanagi in a polite tone. It's just some insects that tried to kill my Souta. Yanagi snorted and replied to the captain. The captain smiled wryly and understood that he would not get any information from her. The captain turned around and saw a petite girl with blue hair and blue eyes. The girl was Lumilia. Sir, I'm Lumilia von Asvers from Asvers family. I will recount what happened here to you. Lumilia introduced herself first as she wanted the captain to know that she was a noble lineage so that he wouldn't doubt her. There's another reason why she did that. It was because she doesn't want these city guards to bother Souta and the rest for information. Lumilia started to recount what happened here without missing a single detail. The captain listened to every word that came out of her mouth. While Lumilia was talking with the captain, Souta was having a hard time as Yanagi kept looking at him. Yanagi sat down in front of him and started on his face. This action made Souta uncomfortable. Damn. What's wrong with this girl? Souta cursed inside his mind. After a few minutes, Yanagi stood up and patted her clothes. She clasped his cheeks and said, "I'll go now. If I stay here anymore, close to you, then, I think I wouldn't be able to hold myself back. I might devour you." "Right, just go now," Souta said as he ignored the second part of her words. "It's better to ignore the words coming out of this crazy girl." Yanagi turned around and disappeared like a bubble. Her presence also disappeared, so Souta was sure that she already left. He sighed in relief and called Brando to help him. This time, Brando helped him quickly. The city guards asked them a few questions before they let them leave. But Souta, Brando, Lumilia, and CL.U.S.Ter didn't leave immediately as they knew that Brian was buried underground. They waited for the city guards to clear the place and they found the unconscious Brian. They went to healers with Brian to get some first aid. "Damn. Who's that girl? She's so powerful. I thought I would die this time," Brian said in a loud voice. His body was covered in bandages as he was the one who received heavy injuries among them. "That's the most powerful student of the Ladro Institute," Souta said with a tired expression. "Really?" Brian looked at him. Yeah, she's the one," Souta said. After walking for a few minutes, the group arrived in Souta's house. They entered there and rest for a while. They didn't have the energy to play because of what happened. Really? What a bad day, yet good at the same time. It was bad because Souta was tired enough because he drained his mana and stamina. It was good because he received a lot of skill points in just a single day. Chapter 109, Rank 2 Mage. Souta prepared a room for Brian and Brando in his house. They protected Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter so they were quite tired. He let them rest so that they could recover a bit of their strength. CL.U.S.Ter went to Yuko and played with her while Lumilia was guarding her. Souta walked outside and sat beside Lumilia who was watching Yuko and CL.U.S.Ter. He didn't say anything as he simply watched Yuko. After a few seconds, Lumilia opened her mouth and asked, "How are you?" "I'm fine. I'm just tired as I exhausted my mana and stamina," Souta replied to her. "Then, what about Brando and Brian?" Lumilia asked. Brian's injury was grave so he needed the rest the most. I'm surprised that he could even talk with that kind of injury." Souta explained to her Brian's condition. He let Brian drink some of his recovery potions to speed up his recovery. But he only used low-level potions, not the medium-level potions, so it would take a few days maybe a week before Brian recovered. If it was a medium-level potion then Brian would be jumping and laughing right now. Well, Souta wouldn't use it for something like this. Those medium-level potions of his were reserved for emergency use for Yuko and him, not other people. "I see." Lumilia nodded at him and she waited for him to explain about Brando. She will buy potions or pills later to help the two recovered. "Brando. I've got to say that his condition is worse," Souta said as he looked up in the blue sky. "Worse?" Lumilia glanced at Souta as she couldn't understand why Brando's condition was worse than Brian. How was Brando's condition worse compared to Brian who almost died? "I can see it. He's trembling, he's scared, and he's afraid. I can see all of it in his movements," Souta said as he closed his eyes but he still continued explaining, "His face is pale and he's holding himself back not to puke. He's physically better than Brian but mentally. It's his first time seeing people brutally killed in front of him." With regard to this kind of thing, Souta thought that Brian was used to seeing that scene. Even CL.U.S.Ter was better than Brando. Well, after they experienced the calamity in the desolate woods who wouldn't toughen their mind. This was the reason why Souta concluded that Brian and CL.U.S.Ter's background was deeper than Brando. Then, what about him? Souta doesn't know what he's like in the earth as he could only remember vague images up until now. Right now, if Souta was to say it he would admit that he's cold-blooded. He felt nothing when he massacred those bandits and he even used their soul to strengthen himself. All the people he killed would lose the chance to be reborn again as their soul became a nutrition in his body. Souta opened his mouth and added, "If he couldn't come up with himself then his mind will break." "Then, what should we do?" Lumilia asked him. She remembered how many corpses they saw in the desolate woods. She still couldn't forget that scene. She sometimes wondered at night how lucky they were at that time. Souta shook his head in response to her question. "Nothing, he himself needed to do this." "Souta, how did you get so strong?" Suddenly, Lumilia asked this question out of nowhere. Souta looked at her and wondered why she asked that. He recalled before that she needed the mystical light cherry to increase her strength. It seems that some internal fight was happening in their family. "I don't know, I just didn't give up to any challenges that I face," Souta replied to her questions. Actually, he didn't know how he would reply to her question, luckily something came in his mind. Only he knew the real answer and the reason why he's strong was because of the system. If he didn't have the system then he was sure that he was still in the undead sanctuary. That's why he's trying his best to learn combat arts and spells without the help of the system so that there's a skill that he could call his own hard work, not the work of the system. Souta shook his head and he stood. I'm going inside the house. If there's anything you can ask me. I'm in the first room on the second floor. Without waiting for her reply, Souta went inside the house. Okay. Lamilia nodded and she gazed at his retreating back. Souta went to the last room on the first floor. This room was the room where he placed the potions and pills that he collected throughout his journey. He also bought some of these potions and pills for emergency use. He approached the red potions that were stocked in the cabinet. He got these potions from the money he got from selling the monster orb. He reached out his hand and picked one of the middle-level potions. He opened the lid and drank it without hesitation. After a few seconds, he felt warm energy circulating inside his body. He noticed that his wounds were healing rapidly. The healers that the city guard brought only used light heal to him and the rest of the victim. If he wanted to completely heal his wounds, it would cost money. That's the same in the institute. They would only use healing spells until they were sure that they will survive from the injury they received. That's why Souta, Brian, Brando, and the rest of the students weren't completely healed after the special test. Points were needed if they wanted to fully recover. It's good. If someone attack us right now, I could probably repel them. Souta said and hoped that someone attacks them. Well, it will trigger another quest and that's what he wanted. That's why he didn't let Lamilia leave quickly. Since she was the target, he wanted her to stay by his side in case someone attacks her. Ha ha ha, what a lucky girl. She already gave me a lot of quests. I will squeeze out all the quests that I could trigger from her. Souta laughed before he stood up and locked the door. After he locked the door, Souta sat in the center of the room. He closed his eyes and looked at the system. I guess it's time to promote my class. He had 11 skill points in total and he only needed 10 skill points to level up the Shadow Bind spell to level 10. Without hesitation, he used 10 skill points to level up his spell. As soon as the Shadow Bind spell hit the level 10, a system prompt sounded in his mind. You fulfilled the requirements for promoting the mage class. Do you want to rank up your class to rank 2? Yes/no. Yes. Souta said in his mind without hesitation. You've successfully ranked up to rank 2 mage. Intelligence attributes have increased by 30. Strength, agility, dexterity, and vitality attributes have increased by 20. Mana pool increased by 80. Magical resistance increased by 100%. Mana recovery increased by 15. Spell power have increased by 100. Souta felt the increase in his stats and mana. It was a pleasant feeling knowing that he got stronger. Race, Goblin Corruptor, 2nd evolution. Level, 24. Class, rank 2 mage, darkness. Health, 596/596. Stamina, 348/348. Mana, 790/790. Strength, 314, 254 plus 60, plus. Agility, 403, 203 plus 200, plus. Dexterity, 390, 190 plus 200, plus. Intelligence, 300, 240 plus 60, plus. Vitality, 248, 238 plus 10, plus. Free attribute point, S74. Spell, S Fireball level 1, Ice Shot level 1, Light Heal level 1, Agility Boost level 1, Strength Boost level 1, Mudslide level 1, Shadow Bind level 10, Shadow Spike level 1, Shadow Ball level 1. Trait skill, S Corruption. Next, to promote to rank 3 mage he needed one of specialty to reach level 10. He decided that he will use the Shadow Ball spell to promote to rank 3 mage. He would be able to cast multiple Shadow Balls at the same time if he levels it up. It would help him a lot if he could teleport to many different shadows. It would also help him divert the attention of his enemies that knew the effect of this spell. Souta lifted up his hand and silently cast the Shadow Bind spell. The floor turned into pitch black color and several shadows that looked like tentacles sprouted. The atmosphere of this spell was entirely different when it was level 9. Souta was sure that even the top 1 ranker of the first year Jiren wouldn't be able to escape this binding spell. Before in the special test, Jiren was just wiping his Shadow Bind spell easily. The assassins too did that. But now Souta was sure that this spell would be able to bind Jiren for several seconds. Even though it's a tier 1 spell, it's still a level 10 spell. Plus, all of his spells were 100% more powerful than before because he became a rank 2 mage. Its effect was closer to a tier 2 spell. Chapter 110, if you have any problem just ask me. Souta could feel the difference of level 10 Shadow Bind spell. He could control these shadows like a part of his body. Really, what a strange setting. There's no function like this in the game. He clenched his fist and cancelled the spell. The floor turned back to normal and the shadows dissipated into thin air. Souta stood up and picked up the bag that he always brought in his adventurer's quest. He reached out his hand towards the potions and picked the bottle with orange liquid. This was the monster potion that he acquired in the underground base when he was trying to get the Vajra sword Saya. He lifted it up and observed it before he placed it inside his bag. He was already a rank D adventurer, so he would start taking difficult quests, and perhaps there's a situation that he couldn't handle with his current strength, like before when the assassin came to kill Lumilia. He needed to bring this to him all the time in case something bad happened. Souta also placed middle-level health potion and middle-level mana potion in his bag. With his current health and mana, it would require this level of potion to recover a large amount of his mana and health. The only thing he needed right now was the potion that could recover his stamina. Unfortunately, that type of potion was pretty hard to acquire even at this large kingdom. Suddenly, an idea came into his mind. Souta recalled that Jimmy was an influential merchant. He had a lot of connections across the whole kingdom and the neighboring countries. If it's Jimmy, Jimmy could acquire it for him. Souta just needed to invest a large amount of money in this. Well, that's not a problem for me, Souta muttered as he rubbed his chin. Souta exited the room and went to his room on the second floor. He picked up a pair of gloves there and changed the gloves that he was wearing. He fought several battles this day and his gloves were tattered. Also, the glove on his left hand was gone. The only thing that was covering his hand was the bandage that he wrapped. He went outside the room and bought drinks for Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter. He saw that CL.U.S.Ter was sleeping on Yuko's soft and fluffy fur. When did Yuko let her sleep on her like that? Souta wondered when he saw this scene. He only knew that when he brought CL.U.S.Ter here in his house, she was only playing with Yuko. He smiled and he approached Lumilia. He reached out his hand that was holding a glass of fruit juice to her. Here. Thanks. Lumilia received the glass of fruit juice. She looked at CL.U.S.Ter with gentle expression. She fell asleep, huh? Souta muttered in a low voice. Yeah, she's tired after what happened this day. She's just a child, yet so many things have happened to her. Lumilia said with a somewhat sad expression. Souta glanced at Lumilia before he asked, then, do you want to find her parents? But I'll say something first. If we started to look for CL.U.S.Ter's family, we naturally would get the attention of the group that targeted her. So if you choose that path, be prepared for the worst scenario. Lumilia didn't know what choice to choose. She wanted to help CL.U.S.Ter find her family, but it would gather the attention of the organization that was after her. She didn't have enough information to know the name of that organization and their hideout. You know, it's not easy to fight that organization. Even my strength right now isn't enough. Also, even if you reported it to the city guards, we wouldn't get their help because we don't have any evidence or proof. Souta paused for a moment before he added, that's why you don't need to worry about her right now. Just keep on training until you acquired enough strength. Well, if you're in the top ranker, you can go in that organization's hideout anytime you wanted because the top ranker was protected by the institute. Unfortunately, we don't know where their hideout. Lumilia lowered her head and gazed on the ground. She was digesting everything that he said. I forgot to tell you one thing, Souta said as he looked up in the sky. The sky was slowly getting dark and the wind was getting chilly. Lumilia tilted her head as she looked at him while waiting for what he was about to say. She wondered what he's going to say to her. Those people before weren't after CL.U.S.Ter. They were after you, so be careful. I advise you to keep looking at your surroundings and report it if you found strange people. Souta said with a serious expression. Why? Lumilia was stunned when she heard that those people were after her, not CL.U.S.Ter. That man before was the knight I fought in the desolate woods. He also survived that calamity and came here for revenge. Souta paused for a moment, then he glanced at Lumilia. Well, since you're noble, he thought that we are your subordinates. So be careful, there may be more of them. Lumilia looked down as there's a lot of things that in her mind. Her problem in her family and now this assassination. While she was thinking about things, she heard Souta's voice. Don't worry about it. If you have any problem, just ask me and I will help you with everything I've got. Just ask me sincerely and I will do it for you. She lifted up her head and saw Souta's retreating figure. She tightened her grip on the glass of fruit juice and muttered, thank you. After 2 hours, Souta woke up Brian and Brando, who were sleeping in his house. It's already dark. You can go back to your house now. Souta said in a loud voice. Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter were behind him watching him. Woke up the two. 5 more minutes. Brian muttered as he used the blanket to cover his head. Souta sighed when he saw this. He reached out his hand and grabbed Brian's wounds. He gripped it tightly so that Brian would feel the intense pain. Ouch. Brian cried out in pain as he jumped off the bed. Okay, next is Brando. Souta said. Brandon was easy to wake up. He wasn't Brian that wanted to stay here to rest. Brian and Brando went to their home, while Souta walked Lumilia and CL.U.S. Tur to Lumilia's apartment. He was worried that some people would attack once again. Thank you. Lumilia thanked him as she slightly bowed her head. Don't worry about it. Remember my words before. If you have any problem just ask me. Souta shook his head and said to her. He then looked at CL.U.S. Tur and patted her head. Be a good girl, alright. Yes, I'll listen to Sister Mila. CL.U.S. Tur nodded her head. Good. Souta looked at Lumilia and said, I'll go now. Yes, thank you, Lumilia said. Souta woke up early in the morning. He pushed himself into a seated position and looked outside through the window. He stood up and went to the bathroom to wash his face. After that, he went downstairs and prepared breakfast for him and Yuko. I will start accepting those difficult quests. He muttered while cooking fried egg and fried rice. He was already a rank D adventurer, so he would start accepting those difficult rank D quests that will give him 1 skill point per quest. With his current rank, that's the maximum skill point he could get from rank D quest. It will be a different matter if it was a rank C and above quest. He had breakfast with Yuko before he departed and head straight to Ladro Institute. Inside the institute, Souta found that a lot of students were glancing at him from time to time. He went to the cafeteria and bought a coffee before he went to his classroom. He found that Alice and Brian were already in their seat. Souta entered the classroom with coffee in his hand. Good morning, class rep. He greeted Lumilia and he walked towards his seat. Ah, good morning Souta. Lumilia greeted back. Souta placed the coffee in his hand on top of his desk before he sat down. He looked at Brian and saw that he was sleeping soundly. Then, he turned his head to Alice and asked, What's wrong with our class? The class went silent ever since he arrived here. They were all looking at him, Brian, and at Lumilia. There are rumors about you fighting some assassin yesterday after class, Alice replied to him. It seems that she was listening to the class. Yeah, that's true. Those assassins are strong. I couldn't even defeat them on my own. Souta said to her before he took a sip of his coffee. Lin, who was beside Lumilia, looked at Souta with a concerned look on her face. See? I already said that Souta is fine. Lumilia said to Lin in a low voice. I really was worried about him. Ah, Mila, why are you together with him yesterday? Lin asked. She recalled that Souta and Lumilia were together from the rumors that she heard. Also, they were in a restaurant. Lumilia was surprised at her question. Chapter 111, Is this what they called fate? The door opened and Bargain went inside. He placed the book that he was holding on top of the table. Good morning, class. He greeted everyone. Everyone stood up and said, Good morning, teacher Bargain. Cough. Bargain coughed and looked at the back. Precisely, he was looking at Brian, who was sleeping on his desk. Everyone turned their head and saw Brian, who was sleeping without a care in his surroundings. Lumilia knew that she needed to handle this kind of thing as the class rep. She turned her head and saw that teacher Bargain was still looking at Brian. She actually doesn't want to disturb Brian because of what happened to them yesterday. Brian got injured because of her, that's why she felt guilty about it. Lumilia opened her mouth and said in a loud voice. Brian. Teacher Bargain is already here. Don't sleep in class. Souta, who was beside Brian, nudged him, but unfortunately, Brian was in deep sleep. He wouldn't wake up easily just by someone nudging him, so Souta opened his palm and grabbed Brian's wounds to wake up him forcefully. Ouch. Brian screamed as he stood up. He held his side and felt intense pain coming from his wounds. What the dash? He found that everyone in the class was looking at him. He doesn't have any idea as he was sleeping, so he looked at Souta and asked, Souta, what's happening? You know that it's not good to sleep in class when there's a teacher. Souta simply said. Yeah. Then, why didn't you woke me up before? Brian asked Souta. If Souta woke him up before Bargain came, then the situation wouldn't happen. I wouldn't do that. I just wanted to see you get scolded. Souta said with a smirk on his face. You. Traitor. Brian took a step back and looked at Souta with wide eyes. He asked in a trembling tone, Are we really friends? These two. They really have to talk while everyone is looking at them. Lumilia thought as veins pop up on her forehead. She gritted her teeth and said, Souta and Brian, be quiet. Teacher Bargain is already here. Oi. Brian, you're too noisy. You're making class rep mad. Souta said as he sat down on his seat like nothing happened. Brian didn't know what to reply to Souta's words. In the end, he smiled wryly and said, Good morning, Teacher Bargain. He then sat down on his seat while scratching the back of his head. Bargain sighed helplessly. He knew that Brian was always like this and he never expected him to change that easily. Bargain slowly opened his mouth and said, If you're not feeling well, you can rest in the infirmary. He at least knew that something happened to them yesterday after class. That news spread in the institute like a wildfire and right now almost everyone knew it. Really? Brian asked with a hint of expectations. Yes. Bargain nodded at his words. Then, I'll go now, Brian said before he stood up. He picked up his bag and he exited the classroom without care about his surrounding. Bargain looked at Brian's back and shook his head. Okay, let's start the class. Lunch break. Souta stood up from his seat and said, let's have lunch together, Alice. Let's also check Brian. Alice lifted up her head and looked at Souta. Okay. Souta walked out of the classroom and Alice followed him. At the front row of the class, Lynn grabbed Lamilia's arm when she saw that Souta and Alice leave together. Mila, what should I do? Lynn said with a worried look. I don't know. Lamilia shook her head. She doesn't have any idea what advice should she give to her friend. But you said you know him. Lynn looked at Lamilia with a teary expression. Yeah, but what can I do? Lamilia nodded and asked. Since there were rumors that she, Souta, Brian, and Brando were together yesterday when the assassins attacked them, she just explained herself to Lynn that they were friends. Of course, she explained that it was because of the little girl named CL.U.S.Ter. Where are we going? Alice asked Souta. She found that the path that they were taking was not heading towards the canteen. We're going to the Shield Class 1A, Souta replied to her question. Why? Alice nodded and asked why they were going to that class. I'm going to check if Brando is fine, Souta said. I see. Alice nodded her head and she didn't ask another question. Souta glanced at her when he found that she didn't ask why they were going to Brando's class. It seems that she heard that Brando was together with them yesterday after class. Oh. Souta found it interesting that she was listening to the rumors. It looks like she was listening to the class in her seat quietly. If that's the case, then he didn't have to explain it to her. She's not Brian that would still ask it even though he heard it before. After a few minutes of walking, Souta and Alice arrived in front of the Shield Class 1A. Souta stepped inside the class while Alice just waited in the corridor. As soon as he stepped inside the class, the whole Shield Class 1A gone silent. All the students were looking at him without saying anything. Do you want something here in our class? A tall muscular girl stood up and asked Souta. She had long black hair that was tied on the back of her head. Her skin was tan and her black eyes were looking at him with uncertainty. Souta looked around the class and he didn't saw Brando here, so he turned to the girl that asked him a question. He looked at her from top to bottom and asked, are you the class rep here? Why yes, I'm Chiffon, the class representative of the Shield Class 1A. The girl gulped and she introduced herself. She wanted to turn around right now when Souta looked at her from head to toe. She was nervous talking to the man who destroyed their whole class alone in the special test. According to the rumors, Souta did not only obliterate their class in the special test. He also defeated various top rankers alone, making him the strongest first year. According to the assessment of the special test, there's currently no first year that could fight Souta in an equal match. It would take various top rankers to subdue him. His power level wasn't only the level of first year students. So you're the class rep. Where is Brando? Souta nodded and asked her. He's absent. Chiffon replied to his question. I see. Thanks. Souta nodded and thanked her before he turned around. He was about to leave the classroom when Chiffon called him. Ishi. Souta stopped and he turned his head to look at her. He saw her looking at him in the eyes. What is it? He asked. He wondered if she wanted something from him or not. Is it true that some people attacked you and Brando yesterday? Chiffon hesitated at first before she asked. She had no way to confirm this rumor as Brando was absent today. Their teacher also didn't say anything about this incident. She wanted to know the truth about why Brando was absent today. Yeah, it's true. Some weird people attack us out of nowhere. Souta said before he exited the classroom without waiting for her response. How is it? Alice asked him as soon as he came out of the classroom. Brando is absent, Souta said as he looked back in the Shield class. Brando's injury wasn't that worse. In terms of injury, Brian's injury was worse among the rest of them. He was knocked out yesterday as he got caught up in Yanagi's attack. Still, Brian managed to go to the institute despite his heavy injuries. Souta knew that physical injuries weren't Brando's problem. It's about his mental health. It seems that what happened yesterday was still bothering him up until now. Don't think about it. Let's just go now and have lunch. Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder. He started to walk towards the direction of the canteen. Fine, Alice said and she followed him from behind. In the principal's office. Yanagi Shina was standing in front of the principal, Azrim Duragan. Azrim looked at Yanagi with a frown on his face. He placed the paper files in his hand on his table. A loud sound echoed in the whole room as the stock of paper landed on the table. Yanagi, can you tell me the reason why you are in that place yesterday? Azram asked Yanagi with a serious expression. I'm just shopping yesterday and found that my schoolmates were being bullied by some unknown people, so I decided to help them. Yanagi smiled and replied to him. Are you sure that's what you're doing? You're not following Souta Ishii, right? Azram said as he stared deeply at Yanagi's eyes. It's just a coincidence that I met Souta there. Yanagi smiled brightly and said. Is this what they called fate? How did you know him? I'm sure that you don't have any acquaintance in first-year students. Azram asked her. Also, I've heard a report from the teachers of the first year that you snuck in the special test yesterday. What will you say about that? TCH. Those damn teachers. As I thought, they are going to be in my way from pursuing Souta. Yanagi clicked her tongue and said in a low voice with an annoyed expression. I can hear you, you know. Azram said with a sigh. Chapter 112, Meeting the Gale Group. A week had passed since the assassination incident in the shopping district. The incident gathered a lot of attention across the whole city. Unfortunately, they didn't have a way to know the culprit's goal as Yanagi Shina killed all of them. Several people died in this incident. The city lord and the institute compensated the family of the victims. It was really a tragic event. The 3 people who were involved in this incident were outside of the Lotro city. The 3 of them were clearing the low-level dungeons in the vicinity of the city. Sheng. Souta pulled out his sword from the body of a 5-meter-tall spider and he placed it back inside its sheath. This huge spider was the boss of this low-level dungeon. In their current level, Souta and Brian wouldn't have a problem clearing this level of dungeon alone. That's too easy. Souta muttered as he looked around him. There's a lot of dead spiders in his surrounding. He then heard a familiar sound in his mind saying that he received a skill point for clearing this dungeon. Yeah, there's no challenge. Brian nodded with a sigh. He really hoped that he could fight some tough opponents in this dungeon. Unfortunately for him, all the monsters here were too weak. The only monster that could put up a fight here was the boss, but even then, it was still too easy for Brian and Souta. The boss only has the power of a top 20 ranker of the first year. Souta and Brian only cleared low-level dungeons. Even though they could easily clear a low-level dungeon, they still haven't touched a single middle-level dungeon at all. Why? It was because the middle-level dungeons were housing the monsters that formed their monster orb. That level of monster could easily obliterate them. The difference between low-level dungeons and middle-level dungeons was huge. Souta turned his head and looked at the person that came with them. He opened his mouth and asked, How is it, Brando? Yeah, I'm starting to get used to it, Brando said as he nodded his head. He was absent the day after the assassination incident. On that day, he was thinking about a lot of things. And when he came back into his mind, he already decided to become an adventurer like Souta and Brian. He thought that he would become stronger by following their footsteps. On that day, he saw it with his own 2 eyes that Brian and Souta didn't have any fear in their eyes when they faced those people. It's like they were used to a life and death battle. Well, if you saw the power of the commandments, would you still be afraid of some mobs? Nay. Good. Souta nodded. He was shocked when Brando came to him and asked to join his party as Brando wanted to become an adventurer. At that time, Souta wondered what kind of things went inside Brando's mind that he suddenly wanted to become an adventurer. Brando could take this level of quest despite being a rank F adventurer was because of Souta and Brian. Souta and Brian were both rank D adventurer. In the adventurer circles, their rank could be considered a veteran adventurer. In the Monster Tide 2 months ago, Souta and Brian's achievements were worth mentioning, so the guild promoted the 2 of them to rank D adventurers. Let's go out now, Souta said before he turned around. Okay, we already did what we came here. Brian nodded and said. He and Brando followed Souta behind. Brian and Brando bid farewell to Souta after they finished reporting the quest that they did. I'll go now, Souta. Let's party sometimes. Brian said as he raised his hand above his head. He then turned around and left. Yeah, let's do that. Souta nodded at him. Thanks for accepting me in your party, Brando said as he slightly bowed his head. Don't mention it. Souta shook his head. Okay, I'll go now, Brando said with a smile. Be careful, Souta said before he turned around and went inside the Adventurers Guild. He walked towards the quest board and looked at it. He wondered what quest should he take right now for him and Yuko. He would start training Yuko so that she could form her own monster orb. If she managed that, then she would become a great asset to him in the future. A quest for Yuko. Souta muttered as he rubbed his chin. Suddenly, someone called his name from behind. Souta turned his head and saw a group of 5 people. Oh! Brianna! He exclaimed when he saw them and recalled that they were the Gale group. They were the party that was with Jimmy at that time when he came out of the deep forest. The Gale group approached him. Brianna, the leader of the group, smiled and said, "We haven't seen each other for a long time. How are you, Souta?" "I'm fine. How about you?" Souta smiled and asked while looking at the rest of the group. "We're doing fine. We are now rank C adventurers." The one who said those words was Tider, a huge man wearing a full-plate silver armor. He's almost 2 meters in height. "I see. Well, I'm a rank D right now." Souta smiled and said. "Ha ha ha, I know. You've become famous these days. A tamer of the red fur bear. We heard a lot of rumors about you." Tider said as he patted Souta's shoulder. "You've grown a lot since the last time we saw you." "Grown?" Souta looked at Tider with a confused expression. "You know, I haven't gotten taller since the last time." He felt that Tider was teasing him. "No, I'm not talking about that." Tider shook his head and said, "I'm talking about how you've become stronger in just a few months." Everyone from the Gale group nodded their head. When they first saw Souta they could easily guess his power level judging from the mana he's emitting. But now it's different, Souta wasn't emitting mana out of his body. It means that he gained full control over his mana. At that time, Souta's mana manipulation skill was only level 1. He could only do limited things with his mana at that level, but now, he could even use it to protect himself or pressure those who are weaker than him. "Ah, that. Well, I've been training a lot from these past 2 months." Souta explained to them that he was training non-stop in the Lodro Institute. "So you passed the entrance examination?" Tim asked. He was a short man wearing a red robe with blue linings. His black hair almost covered his brown eyes. He was the mage of the Gale group. "Yeah, I'm currently a student of the mage class 1B, Souta said to them. A woman with shoulder-length black hair and glasses on her eyes. She had a beautiful face and a scar below her left eye across her cheek ruined it. Her name was Jane. Jane looked around and asked Souta, "I'm wondering. Where's Yuko?" Since Souta was here, she thought that Yuko was also here, but she hasn't seen Yuko outside the guild either. It seems that Souta didn't bring Yuko with him. "Yuko? She's in my house, guarding it," Souta replied to her. "Since you're here in front of the quest board, you must be picking a quest. Am I right?" Jane smiled and asked him. "Then, how about we party up and take the quest together?" Jane proposed to him that they should party up just for once. "That's a good idea." "Right, Captain." Tider laughed and looked at Brianna. It's really a good idea." Brianna gently smiled. Tider looked at Souta and asked, "How about it, Souta? Are you in?" "Okay, but not now." "How about a week later?" Souta nodded and said. "If he's going to take a quest with rank C adventurers, then he'll take those quests for rank C with high rewards. Also, it's already late and he had to go to the institute tomorrow." "Sure, we have a lot of free time." Brianna smiled and nodded at him. They knew that Souta was a student at Lodro Institute, so they understood that he didn't have a lot of free time. Souta bid farewell to the Gale group before he went back to his house. He planned to take a quest for Yuko, but something came up, so he had to postpone it. Well, it doesn't matter as he will bring Yuko with him in their quest. It was already dark when someone rang Lumilia's doorbell. Lumilia was currently eating dinner with CL.U.S.Ter. Lumilia heard it and wondered who is it. She turned her head and looked at the clock. This whole apartment was Lodro Institute's property. If the guard let this person in, then it must be someone she knew. She stood up and walked towards the door. She grabbed the doorknob and opened it only to find Fred and Jasmine outside. "Fred, why are you here?" Lumilia asked as she opened the door and made a way for Fred to enter. It was then that she noticed that Fred had a gloomy atmosphere around him. "What's wrong with Fred, Jasmine?" Lumilia looked at Jasmine and asked. "Young miss. We came here to pass you this letter from our lord." Jasmine lowered her head and she reached out her hands towards Lumilia. There was a white letter in her hands. Chapter 113, Lumilia's Problem. Lumilia looked at the letter that Jasmine was holding. She received it and looked at Jasmine and Fred. Both of them were looking on the ground, not daring to look at her eyes. "From father?" she muttered, and she opened the letter. She spread the paper and read the words written in the paper. "This." After she finished reading it, the letter fell down on the ground. She couldn't believe what she had read just now. She opened her trembling lips and said, "But I'm still trying my best here in the institute. Something came up in the family and Lord asked us to bring you back." Fred said as he lowered his head. He knew that there's nothing he could do as he was just a mere butler of the Asvers family. "I understand," Lumilia said as she bit her lower lips and clenched her fists tightly. "I'm sorry, young miss. We couldn't help you." Jasmine apologized to Lumilia. "It's okay. It's not your fault." Lumilia lifted up her head and forced out a smile at them. The next day. The cultural festival will start next month, So you lot needed to prepare for your project, Bargain explained to his students the cultural festival. This month the students were going to enjoy being a normal student. There's no battle that will happen and the institute forbid the duel this month. Still, they could learn spells or combat arts here. The institute only forbids battles, not learning or training. They could still rent the training ground to train their skills. Right now, the students were trying their best to increase their strength even a little, so this kind of announcement stunned them. Bargain smiled at them and said, "You've all worked hard, so let's enjoy a normal life this month. No more fighting. I'll let you talk to decide what you'll do at the cultural festival." He picked up the book on the table and exited the classroom. He gave time to his students to talk about things and will let them decide what will they do at the festival. Everyone started to talk about the cultural festival. Everyone has different suggestions, so it was hard to decide what will they do. Souta noticed that Lamilia was silent. It seems that she wasn't in the mood for this kind of thing. She's not in her usual self. Usually, she will be in charge of this kind of situation and she will handle this professionally like she always did. What's wrong with her? Souta muttered as he rubbed his chin. Alice, who was sitting beside him, glanced at him. She saw him rubbing his chin and knew that when he rubbed his chin he was thinking deeply about something or planning wicked things. Mila. Mila. Lamilia snapped out of her daze when she heard someone called her name. She looked up and saw that Nao and Lin were looking at him with concern in their face. What's wrong, Mila? Lin asked her with a worried expression. Nothing. Lamilia shook her head and didn't say anything more than that. If you say so. Nao said while looking at Lamilia. She was still bothered by the fact that Lamilia wasn't in her usual self. Since Lamilia didn't want to talk about it, she naturally has to respect her decision as her friend. If you have any problem you can always talk with us, Lin said to Lamilia. It's useless to talk about this. No one can help me. Lamilia thought as she bit her lower lips. If she's only stronger and managed to secure the top 10 ranker then the institute would help her, but now. It seems impossible. Lin looked at Nao and saw her shaking her head. It means that she shouldn't bother Lamilia or else it would make her angry. Let's leave her for now. We will take in charge of the class and when she's back at it we could leave it in her hands. Nao said to Lin. You're right, Lin said as she took a glance at Lamilia once again. Lamilia recalled Souta's words a week ago. At that time, Souta said that if she has any problem she could ask for his help and he will help him with everything he got. The class decided to continue the discussion tomorrow as they didn't manage to come up with something today. They were still eliminating those things that were impossible to do. Brian wanted to make a tournament where he's the final boss. What kind of idea is that? So Lin and Nao eliminated this idea, making Brian throw a tantrum. Well, some of the students of Mage Class 1B didn't deny that idea. Some of them wanted to do what Brian said, like Randolph. That mysterious guy who defeated Yuriko in one strike. Since this guy likes Brian's idea, it almost made Souta manipulate Brian to probe this guy's strength, but he holds himself back as there's no point in doing that. Brian could hardly defeat the top 10 ranker Johnson, so he wouldn't be able to draw out Randolph's true strength. It's possible if he would fight Randolph in person, but would that guy agree to him? So at the end of the discussion, they didn't manage to come up with anything possible, so they will continue it tomorrow. While packing his things, Souta saw a figure approached him. He lifted up his head and saw Lamilia. Alice and Brian, who was sitting beside Souta, also looked at Lamilia. Do you want something, class rep? Souta asked her. Can I talk to you for a minute, Souta? Lamilia asked back as she lowered her head. Okay. Souta nodded his head. Thank you. Lamilia thanked him before she turned around and exited the classroom. Souta looked at her back and wondered what she's going to say. Brian looked at Souta and asked, What's wrong with class rep today? I don't know, Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder and followed Lamilia outside the classroom. Outside the classroom? So what is it? Souta asked as he looked around and saw that no one followed him and Lamilia here. Can I leave CL.U.S.Tur in your care? Lamilia hesitated at first before she managed to ask him. Okay. I'll take care of her. Souta nodded at her. Lamilia looked up at him with a surprised expression. She was surprised that Souta agreed to her without hesitation, even though he didn't know the reason why she's leaving CL.U.S.Tur. She slowly opened her mouth and asked, You will not ask the reason? Do you want me? Okay, why are you leaving her to me? Souta nodded and asked her like she wanted. Actually, I'll go back to Gripen City this weekend, to my family. I couldn't bring CL.U.S.Tur with me because of some private matters, so I wanted you to take care of her while I'm gone. Lamilia said in a sad tone and she lowered her head. Weekend? Actually, I'm taking a quest this weekend, so I'm not free at all. Souta said to her that he didn't have free time. Lamilia was stunned. She didn't know what to do right now. Did you forget about Brian? You can leave cl.u.s.ter to her. Don't worry about it, Brian could handle himself. Also, once I'm finished with the quest I'll quickly go and fetch her from Brian. Souta said as he assured her. Right? I forgot about him. Lamilia said in a low voice. She was actually reluctant to leave cl.u.s.ter with Brian. She wasn't sure if Brian knew how to take care of a child. Don't compare cl.u.s.ter to other children. It's true that cl.u.s.ter is a child, but she's different from other children. Remember when we first met her? Up until now, she hasn't told us why those people were after her or how she managed to escape in the desolate woods where thousands of monsters live. Souta said to Lamilia. He looked at Lamilia and saw that she didn't say anything. He sighed and patted her shoulder. Don't worry about it, I'll talk to Brian. Souta then walked away from her. Lamilia lifted up her head and looked at Souta's back. You said. Chapter 114, Wanting to Grow. Souta walked back towards his class and saw Brian preparing to leave the classroom. He looked around and found that Alice was gone. It seems that she already left. Brian. He turned to Brian and called him. Brian looked around when he heard someone called his name. He found that it was Souta. What's wrong, Souta? Do you want something from me? I'll tell you I don't have any money. No, I don't care about money. I have a lot of money. Souta shook his head. Then, what is it? Brian asked as he tilted his head. About cl.u.s.ter. You see, class rep is going back to her home, so she needed someone to take care of cl.u.s.ter. I'm busy, so can I leave her to you? Souta explained to him Lamilia's situation. cl.u.s.ter? Okay, leave her to me and I'll protect her. Brian said as he patted his chest. It seems that Brian understood what he's saying. Souta nodded in satisfaction. He smiled and said, thanks, that's all. Okay, I'll go now. I still have something to do after class. Brian said as he bid farewell to Souta while waving his hand. He then ran towards a certain direction of the institute. Sure, be careful on your way, Souta said as he placed his hand inside his pocket. He then saw a person blocked his way. It was Nao. She was Lamilia and Lin's friend. She was standing straight in front of him while her hands were resting on her waist. She had a serious look on her face. Souta instantly guessed why she's blocking his way. She wanted to know where's Lamilia or what did they talk about. Maybe both of them. Before she could say anything, Souta opened his mouth first. Where's Lin? I thought that you two are always together. Souta asked as he looked around and he didn't saw Lin. She have some business. Nao said, then she shook her head. That's not it. She looked at Souta and asked, where's Mila, and what did you two talk about? If she didn't leave, she's still there. Souta said as he pointed his finger on the left side where he just came from. He knew that Nao was worried about Lamilia as Lamilia was really out of character today. For your second question. I will not answer it. If you wanted to know it, you can ask her directly. He said seriously. That. Nao didn't know what to say now that Souta said it like that. You're her friend, right? Just ask her directly. Souta said to her before he left, since there's nothing to do in this place. He guessed that the internal battle of Lamilia's family was getting worse. It raised up to the point where she needed to go back. Well, that's only his guess and there's a possibility that he was wrong. But that's how the plot always moved, right? Brian was standing in front of Bargain. Both of them were in the training ground of the institute. Are you ready? Bargain asked Brian. Yes, I'm ready. Brian nodded with a serious expression. I will train you harder than you can imagine, Bargain said seriously. Yes, I want to grow stronger and protect my friends, Brian replied to him. Brian used his points so that Bargain would teach him privately. Here in the Ladro Institute, every student could use their points on anything in the institute except for a few things like buying the life of students or teachers. In this case, he used his points so that he could get a teacher to teach him privately. Brian wanted to get stronger because he saw how weak he is when the assassins attacked them. He couldn't do anything at that time to protect the people. If not for Yanagi, all of them would die. Come, show me your full power, Bargain said as he lifted up his hand and taunted Brian. Okay, Brian shouted as his mana flared up to the peak. He then went straight to Bargain while pulling back his fist. Too weak. Bargain smiled and he grabbed Brian's fist easily. He tightened his fist and smashed Brian on the ground. Arg. Brian spat a mouthful of blood as the floor cracked like a spider web. Use every spell that you know or else I will knock you out, Bargain said before he kicked Brian. Brian flew and rolled on the ground a few times before he stopped. He looked up at Bargain and used the spells that he knew. Teacher. A woman with long green hair and pupils turned around when she heard someone called him. The dark blue robe she's wearing couldn't conceal her voluptuous figure. She was Sabrina, the teacher of the mage class 3A. Sabrina saw a student wearing a small dark blue robe. The student has long purple hair and purple eyes. The robe indicated that this girl was a mage major. She observed the girl in front of her and asked, "What do you want from me?" "I want to use my points and help me get stronger," Lin said in a loud voice. "You want to use your points?" Sabrina looked at Lin from head to toe. "Yes, I wanted to catch up to someone I admire," Lin said with determination in her eyes. "You know, that getting stronger wouldn't let you become closer to the man you admire," Sabrina said to her. "I know, but I still want to fight beside him. I want him to acknowledge me," Lin said as she clenched her fists tightly. She wasn't the type of girl who pursued strength, but this time. It took a lot of time before she managed to decide that she wanted to grow stronger. Not just for him but for herself too. "Okay, I've seen your determination." Sabrina smiled at her. "Really?" Lin looked at her with bright eyes. "Yes, what's your name, girl?" Sabrina asked her. "Lin Yaeli, a student from Mage Class 1B. Lin replied in a loud voice. Mage Class 1B. She recalled that this class was the talk of the institute in the past few days because of what happened in the special test. A single student of Mage Class 1B dominated the whole special test. Souta Ishii, yes, that's the student's name. The student who showed overwhelming might in the special test that shook the whole institute. Right now, almost every person in the institute knew his name. And this girl in front of her was a classmate of that person. It looks interesting. A lot of points are needed to hire me, you know. Sabrina squinted her eyes and said. "Yeah, I will use everything I've earned," Lin replied to her with a serious expression. Actually, she has a lot of points because all this time she only used it to buy food in the canteen. She didn't even redeem a single skill, all because she thought that it's not that important to her. But everything changed ever since she saw his fight. She thought that it would be awesome to fight beside him. So she decided to use all the points she has to get stronger. Then, it's good. Follow me. Sabrina nodded before she turned around and started to walk away. We're going to train now? Lin asked. Yes, I thought you wanted to get stronger. Sabrina glanced at her from behind and said. Yes. Lin nodded at her. Then, follow me. Don't complain because I will train you harshly. Sabrina said. Yes. Lin nodded and followed behind Sabrina. Just wait and I will be able to stand by your side. She thought. Brian and Lin were not the only ones who asked a teacher to teach them privately. The other students also were beginning to use all kinds of tricks they knew to train. Some of them asked the people outside the institute to teach them while the other used points like what Brian and Lin did. Eugen, Brando, and many other students asked some of the teachers to train them. Everyone was training hard despite the upcoming cultural festival. Well, everyone knew that after this festival it would start another special test that wasn't limited to year level. It means that they will have to fight their seniors if necessary. The next special test was going to be a huge battle between the first year and their senior. It was going to be an all-out battle. Souta looked in the blue sky and muttered, "It seems that a lot of people are busy today." He shrugged his shoulder and went to the market to buy something for Yuko. Of course, he wouldn't forget Yuko's favorite fruit and honey. It was an important part every day he went back to his home. After this, I'll take some herb gathering test or monster subjugation, Souta muttered as he walked towards the direction of the market. Chapter 115, Departure. Days had passed quickly and now it was weekends. It was the day where Lemilia's going back to Gripen City, the neighboring city of Lodro City. Lemilia's family, the Asvers family, was a prominent noble family of Gripen City. Lord Asvers, Lemilia's father, was the famous Earl of the Gripen City. He had a large influence that could rival the city lord in the Gripen City. Souta woke up early in the morning. It was 5 a.m. in the morning, so the sun wasn't up yet. It was still dark outside the house. He reached out his hand and opened the window. The cold breeze of the morning gently blew on his face. "Whew. It's cold," he commented as he wrapped the blanket around his body tightly. Souta has a lot of things to do today, so he pushed himself out of the bed and went straight to the bathroom. After he finished brushing his teeth and washing his face, Souta went downstairs and prepared his and Yuko's breakfast. This is enough. Souta looked at the food he prepared for Yuko with a satisfied look. He then went to Yuko's room and woke her up. "Yuko, we have a quest today, so you need to get up now and have breakfast," Souta said while shaking her huge body. Yuko slowly opened her eyes and looked at Souta. She stuck out her tongue and licked his cheeks when she saw that it was him. "Okay, stop that. I've already prepared your breakfast," Souta said as he patted her head. After he gave Yuko her breakfast, Souta also ate his own breakfast. He then prepared a coffee for himself as he wouldn't forget this. He never misses a single coffee every single day. Souta likes drinking coffee especially when it's morning and the surrounding was chilly. It felt good to warm up his body by drinking warm coffee. Souta was washing the dishes when he heard someone rang his doorbell. Ding dong. Wait. I'm coming. Souta shouted as he washed his hands and head out. When he opened the door he saw, Lamilia with cl.u.s.ter. Souta smiled and said, come here. Lamilia shook her head and said, I needed to go now, so I'll leave cl.u.s.ter to you. Souta started at Lamilia before he nodded. I understand, I'll bring her to Brian. Well, Lamilia didn't know where is Brian's house so she could only leave cl.u.s.ter to Souta. Thank you. Lamilia slightly bowed her head and thanked him. Souta knitted his brows while looking at her. What is it? Lamilia asked when she saw Souta frowned. He had a cold expression on his face and that surprised her. He was looking at her with those cold eyes. Souta raised his hand and opened his palm. He then slowly opened his mouth and said, I'll say this one more time. If you have any problem you can ask for my help sincerely and I will help you to the extent of my strength. Lamilia's mouth was left open as she couldn't say the next words she wanted to say. In the end, she just thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Thank you very much. It's not bad to know that there were people that wanted to help her. Too bad. You lost your chance to get my help. Souta said while looking at her. Lamilia flashed a bright smile and said, I appreciate your will. Thanks for that, I'll go now. Okay. Come here, cl.u.s.ter. Souta nodded before he turned his attention to cl.u.s.ter. cl.u.s.ter nodded at him and she stood beside him while facing Lamilia. Lamilia squatted down and patted cl.u.s.ter's head. He gently smiled and said, Don't give brother Souta and Brian some trouble. Behave like a proper girl. I understand Sister Mila. cl.u.s.ter nodded her head as she grabbed Lamilia's hand. Her eyes were getting wet and her cheeks were turning red. Don't give trouble? Actually, I wanted trouble as there's a possibility that I could trigger a quest. Souta thought when he heard Lamilia's words. Okay, I'll go now. Lamilia stood up before she bid farewell to cl.u.s.ter and Souta. She then turned around left. Souta and cl.u.s.ter looked at her back until they couldn't see her. They entered his house and gave cl.u.s.ter some hot drinks that could warm her up. It's pretty cold outside, after all. Souta went into his room and wore his adventurer's clothes. Leather armor, leather boots, body bag, and pants. All of his equipments were blue-grade except for his earring and sword. These two were different as they were universal and dark-grade respectively. Going downstairs, he saw cl.u.s.ter was still drinking the tea that he gave her. He sat in the opposite direction of her and said, I have a quest right now, so I'll leave you to Brian. You got it? Mn. cl.u.s.ter nodded at him and said, Will Sister Mila come back? I don't know. You see I offered her my help before but she declined. Souta shook his head before he stood up. For him, Lamilia lost her only chance to get help from him as he was about to depart for his quest right now. Speaking of quest, he didn't know what quest the Gale group took. He let them pick the quest that will bring them the best rewards, so he doesn't have any idea at what type of quest they will do. Only the Gale group knew. Well, it doesn't matter as he will know it once he arrived in the Adventurers Guild. He could only hope that the quest they picked will really bring him skill points. He shook his head and placed those thoughts in the back of his head. He looked at cl.u.s.ter and he noticed that the cup of tea was empty. Souta stood up and said, Let's go cl.u.s.ter. Let's meet Brian. Okay, brother Souta. cl.u.s.ter nodded at him and she stood up. Souta glanced at her and he went towards Yuko while cl.u.s.ter followed him. Yuko. cl.u.s.ter ran towards Yuko and she hugged her soft body. We're going now, Yuko, Souta said and he picked up cl.u.s.ter in his arms. He raised her and placed her above Yuko so that she was riding her. Yeah. Go Yuko. cl.u.s.ter exclaimed happily as she raised both of her hands in the air. Souta looked at her and said, Grab tightly, or else you will fall. Oh okay. cl.u.s.ter nodded and she grabbed Yuko's fur. Good, follow me Yuko, Souta said and he walked away. Yuko followed him quietly. After walking for a few minutes, the group arrived in front of Brian's house. Brian's house was just a normal-looking house made of wood. Souta approached the door and knocked on it. Brian. It's me, Souta. Souta said in a loud voice so that Brian could hear him. cl.u.s.ter went down from Yuko and stood beside Souta. After a few seconds, Souta didn't hear Brian's reply. He grabbed the handle of the door and tried to open it. He found that it was locked inside and guessed that Brian was still asleep. Souta sighed and he looked at cl.u.s.ter. It seems that Brian is still sleeping. He said. What should we do, brother Souta? cl.u.s.ter asked as she slightly tilted her head. Of course, I'll wake him up. Stand back and cover your ears, cl.u.s.ter. Souta smiled and said to cl.u.s.ter. cl.u.s.ter nodded at him and she went beside Yuko and covered her ears using her hands. She looked at Souta with a worried expression on her face. Souta took a deep breath and slowly gathered his mana. He controlled it towards his throat before he shouted. Brienne. His shout shook Brian's entire house. His voice was filled with mana and it became powerful and louder than his usual voice. With the level of his mana manipulation skill, Souta could do this much. Mana manipulation skill was really a great skill. Back in the game, it was a useless skill as they couldn't feel the mana there. This skill was only for design and a requirement for the mage class. Souta finally understood why the game was unbalanced and there's a lot of useless skill. It was because the game was created based on the true magic world. The players were complaining back then about why there's no loot in some dungeons. It was because those dungeons were just the breeding place of some monsters. It's natural that it doesn't have any skill books or weapons when the monsters were just wolves, slime, etc. who don't use it. Despite all the complaints, the developer didn't change it at all. It was because the game made it look like this world. Souta wanted to know who developed the game. Creating that game means the developer knew what will happen here and know the existence of this world. While Souta was thinking, the door opened and it revealed Brian with a worn-out look. Oh? Souta and Brian looked at Souta with a tired expression then at cl.u.s.ter. He then recalled what they talked about a few days ago. I forgot that cl.u.s.ter is going to stay here in my house. Don't forget it, Souta said as he rubbed his temple. Chapter 116, Mrs. Veers. Souta and Yuko went towards the Adventurers Guild after he left cl.u.s.ter in Brian's care. He doesn't need to worry about her as Brian will do everything for cl.u.s.ter. That's the kind of guy Brian is. After walking for a few minutes, Souta saw Tider and Jane of the Gale group waiting for him in front of the Adventurers Guild. If he could only use message here just like in the game then he already sent a message to these two. No, even if he could use the message it was pretty useless as he couldn't use message on NPC. They were not NPC now, still, they don't have a system so they wouldn't be able to receive his message. He recalled they used different things from message. If he wasn't wrong it was talisman and rune. Tider and Jane were looking around trying to find him. Then, Tider saw his face and he revealed a smile. He raised his hand and waved it as he called Souta's name. Souta approached the two with Yuko behind him. Sorry, I made the two of you wait. He apologized to them. It's okay, you don't need to worry about it, Tider said to him. Yeah, you don't need to apologize, Jane said and she shifted her gaze to Yuko who was standing behind Souta. She stepped forward and approached Yuko. Still, you brought Yuko with you. You've gotten taller Yuko, unlike your master. Souta's mouth twitched when he heard those words. He took a deep breath and calmed himself down. There's no point in getting angry about it as she was just stating the truth. If she's not telling the truth then he had a reason to get angry at her. Is this what they called the truth hurts? Yuko lowered her head and Jane caressed her head. She could still smile brightly despite the scar on her face. Souta looked at her for a while before he turned his attention to Tider. He asked, so what type of quest did you take? A bodyguard quest. Tider replied to his question. A bodyguard quest. Souta looked at Tider. Yes, it's a type of escort quest. We will guard a noble this time and escort her to the Gripen city. Tider explained to him. Souta nodded at him. So it's an escort quest. The only difference was that they need to stay beside their employer all the time. In an ordinary escort quest, the adventurers will only protect the employer until they reach the designated place that was in the contract. I understand. Shall we head now? Souta nodded and asked as he glanced at Jane who was still patting Yuko's head. Okay. Tider nodded at him and he shouted at Jane. Jane, we'll go now. Okay, Jane replied to a smile on her face. The three of them along with Yuko walked towards the meeting place, the west gate of the city. It took them a dozen minutes before they managed to arrive at the west gate. We're here, Tider said to them. Souta looked around and saw a lot of caravans in front of the huge 30-meter tall gate. This place was bustling as there were many people going in and out of the gate. So which caravan will escort? Souta asked as he looked at all the caravan here. There, the blue one. Brianna and the others are already there. I can see them already. Jane exclaimed as she pointed at the blue caravan. Souta looked and saw the blue caravan that Jane pointed. He stopped on his feet as soon as he saw the blue caravan. Tider looked at him and asked, What's wrong, Souta? Nothing. Souta shook his head and sighed. Really, this coincidence really happens sometimes. He looked up and walked towards the blue caravan. He saw Brianna, Tim, and John waiting for them beside the blue caravan. Souta. You even brought Yuko with you. Brianna said to him. Of course, Yuko is my partner after all, Souta replied to her. Okay, I'll introduce you to our employer, Brianna said to Souta. Brian walked towards the blue caravan and knocked on the door. She opened her mouth and said, Mrs. Veers, we're all here. Also, the other one is here. The other one she mentioned was Souta. Of course, Souta wasn't a member of their group. He just partied them this time as they wanted to do a quest together with him. Also, to deepen their relationship. Adventurers tend to party up together to build up mutual trust through the quest. The employer this time haven't seen Souta at all. It was because Souta wasn't with the Gale group when they took the quest. Also, Souta had to meet the employer to formally sign up the contract of this quest. After a few seconds, the door of the caravan opened, and a short petite girl with shoulder-length blue hair and blue eyes came out of the caravan. The girl has a thick blue tail indicating that she was a demi. Her skin was white as snow and she has a beautiful face. She was wearing a blue dress that matched the color of her hair. Though her figure was that of a child, she exuded a mature charm and cold demeanor. The girl looked at Brianna then at Souta. Her eyes opened widely and her mouth was slightly agape when she saw Souta's appearance. She was beyond shocked and didn't think that they would meet this soon. Souta. A feminine voice escaped from the girl's mouth with a hint of surprise. Brianna, Tider, Jane, and the rest turned their head and looked at Souta with a questioning gaze. The people inside the carriage too cried out. It seems that they also knew Souta. Souta saw everyone looked at him. He lifted up his hand and scratched his head. Ah, you see. The noble Mrs. Veers actually is my fiancée. Everyone exclaimed when they heard his words. What are you saying, Souta? The girl lost her composure for a moment there, but she immediately regained it. It was a joke, Souta said to them. You're joking. Tider looked at him with wide eyes. That's a joke. I really thought that she's your fiancée when you said it with that kind of face. Jane said with a sigh. Oh, I nearly have a heart attack just now, Tider said as he patted his chest in relief. That joke just now and couple it with that look on your face made me thought that you're not joking. That's bad, Souta. Tim said to him. Fine, I won't do it again, Souta said as he scratched his head in annoyance. He then explained, this girl, Lumilia, is my classmate in the Ladro Institute. We're from the Mage Class 1B. This noble girl in front of Souta was none other than Lumilia Vanis Veers. Oh? So she's your classmate? Tider said from the sideline. Souta then reached out his hand in front of Lumilia and said, let's just get to it. Class rep, give me the contract and I will sign it. Oh okay. Lumilia nodded her head before she glanced inside the caravan. Jasmine, give me the contract. She said. Oh. So you're with Jasmine and Fred? Souta said as he peeked inside the caravan. Since he knew these people, there's no need to act reserved. Young miss, this is the contract. Jasmine gave a piece of paper to Lumilia. She then looked at Souta and said, you. Souta. That joke just now wasn't a good one saying that you're young miss fiancé. What if the Lord hear us? You will not say anything when we arrive there. Okay, fine, young Jasmine, Souta said as he raised both of his hands in the air. You. Jasmine glared at Souta. Souta ignored her and he looked at Lumilia. This was the first time he saw her like this. She looked like a proper noble this time with her beautiful blue dress. Also, the atmosphere around her was different from her usual one. Is this what they called the aura of nobility? So she's full on noble mode this time around. Is there something on my face? Lumilia asked him when she saw him starting on her face. You're different from you who visited me this morning, Souta said to her. Ah, that. Lumilia looked down at the paper in her hands and she gave it to Souta. Here, please sign this up. Souta picked up the paper and read it with his eyes. He then glanced at Lumilia, is there a bonus gold? After all, I'm your classmate. No, we're fair here. Actually, it's the opposite. Since young miss is your classmate we should have a discount for hiring you as our bodyguard. Jasmine said to him in a loud voice. Blah blah blah, what a noise he made. Souta said as he picked up a pen and signed the paper since he didn't saw anything wrong with it. As soon as he signed it, he heard a familiar sound in his mind. Bodyguard, protect Lumilia from any harm that will befall her until she finished her objectives in the Gripen City. Rewards, 10,000 EXP, 5 free attribute points, and 3 skill points. Objectives? I need to protect her until she finished her goals in coming back to Gripen City. Souta thought as he rubbed his chin. First, I need to know what her objectives. Maybe, I could help her so that I could speed up the quest. Souta then looked up in the direction of the Gripen city. He placed his hand on the handle of the sword on his waist. I need information. I feel that something big is going to happen today in this quest. Chapter 117, Gripen City. Souta felt that something big is going to occur in the Gripen city. He always trusted his intuition, so he had to prepare himself. There's no harm to him even if he was wrong. He rested his hand on the handle of the Vajra sword Saya that was hanging on his waist. Since the reward for this quest will give him 3 skill points, it wouldn't bring him that much trouble. With his current strength, he could handle the quest that will give him 3 to 5 skill points. He wasn't worried about this at all, he's worried at what's waiting for them in the Gripen city. He rubbed his chin and wondered why the reward for this quest was 3 skill points. Considering what happened before, if that person from Malosa country sent another batch of assassin, then it was surely stronger than before, so the difficulty increases. Souta shook his head and decided to think about these things later when he encountered it. It looks like you're quite close to them, Souta. You even know the name of the maid and butler. Tider said. Yeah, they employed me before, so this was not the first time, Souta replied to Tider as he gave the paper back to Lumilia. You should go back inside now, Souta said to Lumilia. Souta, do you want dash? Lumilia didn't even manage to finish her sentence as Souta interrupted her. Don't worry about me. I'll do my job, you'll do yours. Souta said as he turned around and walked towards the carriage behind the blue exquisite caravan. He knew what Lumilia was about to say. Although he wanted information, he still declined because of the Gale group. He doesn't want to ignore the group as they were in a party right now. It's important to improve his relationship with other adventurers. Especially to those higher ranked than him. In Lumilia's case, she was his classmate, so there's a lot of opportunities to improve their relationship, but the Gale group was different. Adventurers tend to travel from another place to another because of their job. Lumilia looked at Souta's back before she shook her head. Brianna stepped forward and said, I'm sorry for his action. I'll talk to him later. No, it's okay. That's not a problem for me. Shall we go now? Lumilia gently smiled and asked Brianna. Understood. Brianna nodded her head and she called her group. They went inside the carriage and their carriage started moving as they followed the blue caravan in front of them. Yuko was on her 4 limbs. She's walking beside the carriage Souta was. With her body, she couldn't fit inside any carriage, so she had to walk. Traveling to Gripen City from Ladro City will take 10 hours using this kind of carriage and caravan. Souta picked up one of the fruits that he brought here. He stretched out his hand and Yuko ate the fruit in his hand. In case something bad happened, Souta was already prepared for it. He already bought middle-grade mana potions and health potions. There were also some pills that could temporarily increase his stats even for a whole 1 minute. He used several platinum coins to acquire these potions and medicine. He managed to get the potion that could temporarily increase his stamina regen through Jimmy's help. Are you Mrs. Vere's friend? Tider suddenly asked him. Souta pondered what's his answer in Tider's question while rubbing his chin. He asked himself if she was his friend. When he found an answer, he looked at Tider and replied, yeah, I'm her friend. He remembered the time when he and Brian visited cl.u.s.ter. Yeah, she's his friend. Since I could say that she is friend, maybe I could help her even without a quest. But, well, quest is important to me, so she should ask me to help her since she's my friend, or not. Should I force her? Arg. What should I do? Souta rubbed his head with both of his hands. He's having a hard time deciding whether he should help Lumilia or not. Quest was important to him since he could earn skill points with it. Well, let's decide it later when we arrived in the Gripen city. Brianna, Tider, Jane, and the rest of the Gale group just looked at Souta with a dumbfounded expression. They were wondering what he's thinking. Just like that, they smoothly arrived in the Gripen city. Since the route from Ladro City to Gripen City was inside the kingdom, the people who were traveling in this route didn't need to worry. The adventurers were constantly receiving a quest to clean up this route, so there's no need to worry about bandits and monsters. The group safely arrived in the huge gate of the Gripen city. The gate was almost 40 meters tall. The whole Gripen city was larger than a border city, just like Ladro City. The population of the city was larger than any of the border cities in the whole kingdom of Hebre. We're finally here, Tider exclaimed while looking at the huge gate of the city. Yeah. Souta nodded as he lifted up his head and looked in the sky. It was past dusk and the surroundings were getting dark as the lights in the city started to light up one by one. Souta then looked at Brianna and asked, so, what should we do now? Our task is to guard Mrs. Veres until she finished what she had to do here. In other words, we'll become her personal bodyguards. Brianna replied to his question. There's really something wrong with Lumilia's family. If there's not, then why would she hire adventurers to become her bodyguards? Can't the knights in her family do that? Souta thought as he rubbed his chin. He shook his head and looked at Brianna. What is it? Brianna asked him when she saw him stared at him. Souta opened his mouth and asked, are we going straight to Lemilia's mansion or not? That? Souta, I advise you that don't say Mrs. Vare's name that lightly here in the city. Brianna said solemnly. What if I don't follow your advice? What will happen to me? Souta asked back. Nothing. Brianna smiled and replied to him. It seems that she's copying him. Making a joke like that. You got me there. Souta laughed and said, then, what about my previous question? That? Of course, we're going to Mrs. Vare's mansion. Brianna replied to him. She then looked at Tider and Jane. Tider, Jane, have you explained the plan to Souta or not? She asked the two. I forgot about it when I saw Yuko. Jane smiled awkwardly. Hee. Me too. Tider laughed as he scratched the back of his head. Sigh. Brianna sighed when she heard their reply. She then looked at Souta and briefly explained what they have to do in this quest. They will escort Lemilia to her quarters and guard her room. From there, Brianna tasked 2 people to guard the door of Lemilia's room. The next morning, they will go with Lemilia when she visited her father. Of course, they don't know what will the two talked about. Well, a lot of people will visit the Asvare's family starting today. And their job was to protect Lemilia from any harm that will befall her. But all of that doesn't answer Souta's question about why don't the knights of Asvare's family guard Lemilia instead of them. Really, I hate politics the most. I should just do my job and help Lemilia if she somehow needed my help. Souta sighed and thought that things were getting complicated. After a few minutes of waiting, Souta and the others managed to enter inside the Gripen city. Lemilia's caravan quickly went towards the direction of the Asvare's mansion. In the carriage, Souta looked around the city. It was his first time coming here in the Gripen city. He didn't even go here in Gripen city when this was still a game, so he doesn't know the ins and outs of the city. Just from this, he already has a disadvantage when a battle broke out. This world was too big, so it was impossible for him to explore it alone. There's even those unknown continent that only the people from ancient times knows. Also, the Hebraic kingdom wasn't a small country. It was a large country that has more than 100 huge cities. Souta tried to memorize everything that he saw here in this place. The path that they have taken, and he also took note of the huge mansion he saw in their way. We're here in the Asvare's mansion. After a few minutes, they arrived at their destination. Souta and the Gale group got down from the carriage as Lemilia, Jasmine, and Fred too. Souta stood beside Yuko and looked around his surroundings. The yard of this place was too wide and there's a huge white mansion in the center of the field. Around the mansion were 4 exquisite 3-story houses that were connected to the white mansion. In front of the mansion was a huge fountain along with the beautiful trees beside the road. So this is where Lemilia lives? Chapter 118, Who the hell have the guts to disturb my Yuko? Currently, Souta was in the room that Jasmine prepared. Lemilia asked Jasmine to prepare a room for everyone here. They were inside one of the houses beside the mansion. Brianna gave a task to Tider and John to guard Lemilia's room. They changed places every 3 hours so that the other people could rest. While staring outside through the window, Souta heard a knock on the door of his room. He turned his head and asked, "Who is it?" "It's me, Tider." "Souta, it's time." Tider said behind the door. Souta immediately understood it when Tider said those words. It means that Tider and Jane's shift has finished and now it's Souta's time to be on guard duty. He will guard Lemilia's room and protect it from any possible intruder. "Okay, just wait for a minute," Souta replied to Tider before he pushed himself out of the bed. He fixed his clothes and he picked up the Vajra sword. He hung it on his waist before he opened the door. He saw Tider waiting for him outside the room. Yuko was sitting beside the door as her huge body couldn't fit inside the room, so she just stayed here outside the room. Souta felt pity when he saw her sleeping on the cold floor. "So, how is it?" Souta asked Tider as he patted Yuko's head to wake her up. "Nothing strange. But it's too weird this way." Tider replied to him with uncertainty. He doesn't have any idea what's going to happen in this place. Souta looked around first before he said, "Yeah, we don't even know what's going to come here." "Well, let's not worry about it. Let's just do our job." "You're right, we will just smash everything that is in our way." Tider nodded at him. "I'll go now," Souta said to him. "Okay, be careful." Tider nodded his head. Souta walked away and Yuko followed from behind. They were heading towards Lemilia's room. On their way, Souta spotted a lot of knights patrolling around the area. The security was tight and the knights have decent power level, so what are they worried about? Souta thought while looking at the knights. He could sense that these knights were stronger than the knights he fought in the desolate woods. Even he would be able to take them out on his own. Is it because of the assassin? Did they manage to know who's behind that assassination? But even if they knew that, that doesn't answer all the questions. Souta has tons of questions that he wanted to know the answer for him to do better in this quest. Suddenly, an idea came into his mind. Maybe, it's about the other nobles. After all, Brianna said that a lot of people will visit the Asver's family this week. Souta thought as he rubbed his chin. If the other nobles were really involved in this, then this made the situation more complicated. Since this was getting more complicated the more he thought about it, Souta shook his head and decided to remove those thoughts in his head. If those nobles were going to come and prevent him from completing his quest, all he had to do was beat the shit out of them. Thinking about this, Souta's mouth curved into a smile. Politics? I'll crush it with brute strength. After a few seconds, Souta and Yuko arrived in front of Lumilia's room. Souta stood in front of the door and he slowly raised his hand before he knocked on the door. Class rep, it's my shift this time. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here. Souta said before he stood on the side. Souta and Yuko were on duty at this time. The Gale group treated Yuko as another person, that's why Souta and Yuko were alone here. A two-man group of monsters. Souta and Yuko stayed outside of Lumilia's room for 3 hours before Jane and Brianna exchanged places with him and Yuko. Nothing happened this time except for the patrolling knights that wandered in this area. Souta wondered if the security here was really this tight. He went back to his room with Yuko. Souta woke up early in the morning. After washing his face, Souta went out and met the Gale group. Did something happen when I was asleep? Souta asked Brianna. Nothing unusual happened, Brianna replied to him. Souta nodded at her and said, I'll go out to check some things. Okay, we'll guard Mrs. Veers in your place. Brianna nodded at him. Souta and Yuko went to Lumilia. He said the same thing to her and Lumilia agreed. She didn't have any problem with him going out to the market. In one of the rooms of the Asver's mansion, a middle-aged man with long blue hair was standing in front of the window. He was a tall man and he had blue eyes that were staring at Lumilia's room through the window. He was none other than the lord of this mansion, Ursus von Asvers. Also, he's Lumilia's father. He slowly opened his mouth and asked, How are my children? Suddenly, a voice of a man replied to his question. They're fine, my lord. The Vidrato, Bernfiath, and the Friedem family will arrive soon. I really didn't think that Lumilia would incur the wrath of the nobles from Melosa country, Ursus said, and he paused for a moment before he continued, It's been 20 years since we managed to repel Melosa's army. Really, what a timing, Lumilia. Now that of all times. Then, what should we do, my lord? Someone asked Ursus in a polite tone. Right now, there's nothing we could do. The nobles here are pressuring us so that they could get a piece of that thing. They wanted us to sell it to them and they will help us in dealing with those nobles from the Melosa country. Ursus massaged his temple as things were getting complicated this time. Tighten our security and defend our treasury. Also, put some people to know what my children are doing. Understood, my lord. The person in the shadow said before it vanished. Ursus sighed and said, What a troublesome children I have. They only brought trouble to this family. Souta and Yuko arrived in the market after walking for a few minutes. The shopping district in the city was larger than the one in Ladro city. Souta observed the shopping district and thought that there's nothing wrong in this place. He also tried to find if someone was following him, but he didn't discover any people that were following him. A class rep, why this complicated quest only has 3 skill points as a reward. He sighed and thought that he's thinking too much about Lumilia's problem. It's not his problem, to begin with. But well, she's his friend, so he will help her solve her problem with his power. A lot of people in this place were giving Souta a glance. It was because of the red fur bear behind him. It's like it was their first time seeing a tamer walking around like this. Yuko, ignore them, Souta said as he continued walking while looking around him. Then, Souta saw a coffee shop from the corner of his eyes. Oh. Lucky. Let's go, Yuko. Mew. Yuko followed him closely from behind. Souta went inside the coffee shop and ordered 1 cup of coffee while Yuko waited outside the shop. He felt pity about Yuko because of her size. She couldn't enter inside this place. If I'm the king of this kingdom, I will not let these people who build small doors. Yuko couldn't even go inside a coffee shop. Souta muttered to himself. If he somehow became a king, then he will create a law that forbids people from building a small door. He doesn't want Yuko to always wait outside. He then wondered if Yuko evolved, maybe she will grow smaller. If she's smaller then it's good, but if she grew larger than she is currently it would become a problem. Souta rubbed his chin and muttered, maybe, it's time for me to create a summoning circle. After this quest, I will start finding the recipe to create it. Since I could learn all skills regardless of class, maybe it will work out. If that really works, then Souta would be able to summon Yuko anytime he wanted like a proper tamer. Okay, I've decided that after this I will prioritize it more than anything for Yuko. Souta laughed while rubbing his chin. The other customer here in the cafe looked at him as if they were looking at an idiot. After all, they could hear that Souta was murmuring something. After a few seconds, the waitress arrived in front of Souta and said, Sir. Souta snapped out of his thoughts when he heard someone talk to him. He looked up and saw the waitress with his order. Here's your order, sir. The waitress said with a professional smile, and she placed his order on top of his table. Thanks. Souta thanked her before he took a sip of it. It's good, but it couldn't match the one at Ladro Institute. Suddenly, he heard a commotion outside the cafe. He quickly stood up when he heard a familiar roar. Yuko. That's Yuko's voice. Who the hell have the guts to disturb my Yuko? Souta's face contorted in anger. He accidentally crushed the cup of coffee that was in his hand due to his anger. Chapter 119, Punishment. It's his second day here in the city and someone made a move to Yuko. He's already living for a few months in Ladro City and he hasn't met someone made a move to his precious bear. Did this mean that Ladro City was better than Gripen City? Souta knitted his brows. The roar he heard was definitely from Yuko. The people from here were really testing him. He stood up from his seat and walked towards the exit with a frown on his face. Outside the cafe, Souta saw a group of knights surrounding Yuko. He looked at the emblem on their chest and saw that it came from a different noble family. 5 knights were all pointing their sword at Yuko. Yuko was roaring at them, trying to intimidate them. A lot of people were looking at the scene as if they were watching a movie. None of them tried to stop the knights. These nobles were really making him angry. They didn't know their limit and thought that everything was for them to take. Souta exhaled and muttered, "Shadow bind." Suddenly, the whole ground turned into black. Everyone was stunned when they saw the scene, but the spell wasn't finished yet. In the next moment, several shadows burst out of the ground and strangled the limbs of the knights. What's this? Is this the bear skill? The knights tried to break out from the shadows, but it only made themselves worse because the more they struggle, the tighter the shadows become. Ugh. Arg. Help me. All of them groaned in pain as they felt their limbs were going to snap at any moment. The people who were watching this quickly move away, afraid of going the same experience just like those knights. The pitch-black ground gave an eerie feeling that something was about to come out of it. Yuko. A voice sounded in the whole place. All of them turned over to look and saw a short man with dark green skin. The man had short black hair with golden color pupils. This man was Souta Ishii. Souta walked beside Yuko and patted her head. Don't worry about it, Yuko. I will handle the dash. He didn't even manage to finish his sentence when he saw a blood stain on Yuko's fur at the corner of his eyes. What is this? He checked it and found that Yuko had a small cut on her waist. A man with blonde hair stepped forward with a frown on his face. He was wearing exquisite clothes. There's no doubt about it that he's the young lord of these knights. The man opened his mouth and said, "Are you the owner of this bear? How much dash?" Suddenly, Souta aura exploded. A gust of wind swept out in the whole area. He slowly turned around and looked at them with wide eyes. Hee hee, you can go to hell now. Souta laughed as he grinned widely. Then, several shadows burst out of the ground and bound the young noble. He didn't need to hear what the young noble was about to say, as he could guess it from the first word. What's the meaning of this? HMPF. The young noble said before a shadow covered his mouth so that he wouldn't be able to say anything again. This was the power of the level 10 Shadow Bind spell. This spell was clearly different when it was still a level 9 spell. It evolved after it became level 10, so its power was close to a tier 2 spell. No, its power was already in the realm of a tier 2 spell because of the plus 100% increase in spell power when he became a rank 2 mage. Yeah, what's the meaning of this? Souta walked towards the young noble and asked with a smile on his face. He was boiling in anger right now. Yuko was just waiting for him and they did that to her. They cut her. It's a different matter if Souta and Yuko did it first. He will not get mad over it, but judging from the scene he saw before and the condition of the knights, it seems that Yuko didn't fight back. If she fought back, then there's a high chance that Yuko would be able to defeat these 5 knights. Souta frowned as he felt several eyes on his. He looked around and clenched his fist. Settle down. Several shadows burst out of the ground. It stood straight, forming a circle around him so that the other people couldn't see what's happening here. This shadow bind spell of his was different from the other. He could control these shadows like a part of his body. My attitude depends on how you treat me and the people close to me, Souta said to the young noble. Even Souta knew that he wasn't a good person like Brian, who pursued justice more than anything. Souta knew that his hands were dirty as he already killed hundreds of living creatures in this world. He's not going to make an excuse, as he knew that no matter what's your excuse, he still killed a living creature even if it's only an accident. No matter what excuse a person have, killing is killing. A person still took a life and that will not change anything. The young noble opened his eyes widely when he saw Souta's face. He finally realized what he was about to face. He wanted to scream but he couldn't because of the shadow covering his mouth. Souta took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. Okay, I'm calm now. I will not kill you but I'll punish you. The first part of his words made the young noble sigh in relief but the second part made his face turn pale. He struggled with all of his gut but he didn't have sufficient strength to break free from the shadows. Break. Souta said in a cold tone and the shadows that were binding the young noble and knights tightened. He wouldn't kill them as it would give him a lot of trouble if he killed them. There's a lot of witnesses in this place, so even if the city guard arrested him. The people here knew that the young noble started this whole mess, not Souta. If it comes to worse then Souta would just use his money to bail himself out. After all, he didn't kill anyone in this place. Even if the one he beaten was a noble, Souta knew that he wouldn't stay in jail for a long period. They would just get his information and asked him a question about the incident. It tightened to the point that it crushed their bones. Arg. The knights screamed as several bone-cracking sounds echoed in the whole area. You people shouldn't have disturbed me when I'm having a coffee, Souta muttered as he turned around and cancelled the spell. The young noble and the knights fell down on the ground with a loud thud sound. All the bones in their hands and legs were broken. All the people in the area were looking at him with fear in their eyes. They heard the scream of the knights when Souta broke their bones. Souta ignored those gazes and he went inside the cafe. He paid the bill of the coffee that he ordered before and the cup that he accidentally crushed. Souta glanced at the young noble and the knights one more time before he turned around and started to walk. Let's go, Yuko. Yuko ran after him. The young noble that Souta beat was a spoiled brat. There's no doubt about it. It's pretty rare to encounter this type of person. Souta encountered a lot of young nobles in Lodro City but they never mentioned Yuko to him. This city was really testing him. After a few minutes, the city guard arrived in the scene. They found the injured noble and knights. All of them have broken bones. They asked some of the people around the area and understood that a tamer was the one who did this. Souta was already gone from the scene so they couldn't find him. Souta went back to Lumilia's mansion. There, he saw that the Gale group was doing their job in guarding Lumilia. Souta, you're back. Tiger waved his hand when he saw Souta. Yeah. I'm here. Souta nodded with a smile. Oh? What happened to Yuko? Jane saw the small cut on Yuko's waist so he asked Souta. It's just that someone didn't know their place so I teach them some lesson. Souta shook his head and said. He didn't say anything more than this. I see. The Gale group nodded their head. They didn't ask any more since Souta looked like he didn't want to explain it to them. Souta saw their worried look, so he smiled at them and said, Don't worry about it, it's merely a brat. Even if they went back to me, I will beat all of them including his father. Chapter 120, It's because he is Souta Ishi. Souta used light heal spell on Yuko's wound. While he was cleaning Yuko's wounds, Souta heard footsteps coming from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who is it. Souta opened his mouth and asked, What is it? The one you beat is the son of an influential man in other city, Lumilia said. The news already spread out and everyone knew that a man with a red fur bear was the one who did it. I don't care about who's that man. Even if he's a king, I still beat the shit out of them. All of them are the same to me. Souta replied to her. They'll come back you know, Lumilia said to him. Tell them I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, I can't wait for it. Souta grinned as there was a chance that it could trigger a quest. He's truly looking forward to them coming back to him. That man is my fiancé. Lumilia revealed some information to him. I see. Souta replied without turning around to look at her. On the surface, he looks calm but deep inside Souta was shocked by what he heard. That man was her fiancé? Too much coincidence was happening recently. Lumilia just looked at Souta's back. She couldn't guess what was on his mind. Suddenly, a knight approached them and said, Young miss, the Lord wanted you to come and meet him. Lumilia looked at the knight and said, Understood, go tell my father that I will go there. Yes, young miss. The knight bowed before her before he left to tell Lumilia's father what she said. Lumilia looked at the knight before she shifted her attention to Souta. She opened her mouth and said, I'll go now. I still have something I need to do. Souta turned his head and looked at her. He asked, Do you want me to escort you? No, just continue cleaning Yuko's wound. I'll just ask Brianna and the rest. Lumilia shook her head and said to him. Are you sure? You know, I'm currently one of your guards. Souta asked her just to be sure. Lumilia hired him, so he thought that he should do something for her. I'm sure. Lumilia smiled before she turned around and walked away. Souta stood up and looked at her back. The corner of his mouth curved into a grin. This pattern. The fiancé, the father, and the nobles. Souta was starting to understand what's happening in this mansion. All of them were connected to each other but there's still some unknown piece to complete the puzzle. In other words, Lumilia came back here to meet her fiancé. But why? This timing. Is it about the incident in the Lodro city? Have they already finished the investigation and identified the corpses of those assassins? If that's the case, then Lumilia's father already knew that she was the target of a certain noble from the country of Melosa. If Lumilia's father really knew about it, then it's natural that he called Lumilia back to the mansion. But why is the fiancé coming here at this time? Is it a coincidence? No, at the very least Souta didn't think that it was a coincidence. Then, there's a possibility that the other nobles were moving as well. From the information Souta had, he knew that a lot of noble was going to visit Asver's mansion because of some unknown reason, and that reason was Souta wanted to know. Nevertheless, they were going to strip Lumilia's freedom out of her. That's what Souta could guess, and she will not be able to go back to Lodro Institute. If I could trigger a quest, then I will surely. Souta thought, and another idea comes into his mind. From Lumilia's action before, Souta guessed that she doesn't want to get married to that noble. If she loves him, then she would be concerned about his well-being. Okay, I will talk to her later, Souta said with a smile. Ha ha ha, there will be a lot of drama in this quest of mine. Well, that doesn't matter as I will get skill points. Lumilia was wearing a blue dress while walking in a huge hall inside the mansion. In front of her was Jasmine, who was guiding her, and behind her was Brianna and Jane, who was guarding her. Soon, they arrived in front of a huge door. The door wasn't an ordinary one. It was made from rare materials and the design was carved by famous sculptors. A mere tier 1 spell wouldn't leave a scratch to this door. Jasmine stepped forward and gently knocked on the side of the door. My lord, young miss has arrived, Jasmine said in a polite tone through the door. No one said anything. Everything was silent at this time. After a few moments, a metallic sound echoed in the door as it slowly opened. Lumilia turned her head and looked at Brianna and Jane. She said, wait for me, I'll talk to my father. Understood. Brianna and Jane said at the same time. Jasmine took a glance at Lumilia with a worried expression. Lumilia smiled at her in response before Lumilia went inside the room. Inside the room, Lumilia saw two people sitting in the chair from the opposite side of the table. The man on the left side was a middle-aged man with long blue hair and blue eyes. He was Lumilia's father, Ursus von Asvers. While the man on the right side was a chubby middle-aged man with short blonde hair and yellow color eyes. He was exuding a fearful aura around him. He was none other than the head of the Vidrato family, one of the influential families in the neighboring city of Gripen. The two men turned their heads when Lumilia entered the room. The two of them observed her for a while before Ursus, Lumilia's father, opened his mouth and said, this is Gregory Vidrato, the head of the Vidrato family. Also, he's the father of your fiancée, Lumilia. Good day, father and Lord Vidrato. Lumilia greeted them in a polite tone. NN. Gregory nodded his head while looking at Lumilia. Currently, your fiancé couldn't come here because of some accident, Ursus said. Yeah, some pretentious adventurer dared to harm the next heir of the Vidrato family, Gregory said in annoyance as he tapped his finger on top of the table. Really, those adventurers are like that of the barbarian race. All of them are bold enough not knowing who they are offending. Lumilia just looked at them and didn't say anything. She knew the one who did that to the heir of Vidrato family. Just then, Ursus looked at Lumilia and said, Lumilia, I've heard that one of the adventurers that you hired fit the description of the man who assaulted your fiancé. Lumilia subconsciously gulped when she heard her father mention it. Really? Gregory stood up when heard it. He looked at Lumilia as if he was eager to know if it was true or not. Lumilia tried to think of a way to hide the truth, but then she understood that she couldn't hide it anymore. The knights were patrolling around the mansion from time to time, and it's natural that they will saw Souta and the Gale group. If he pushed me to the corner, then I have no choice but to reveal it. She took a deep breath and nodded her head. That's right. He's a tamer of the red fur bear, but I know that the one who started it was Ostar. Lumilia said to them. Ostar was the name of Lumilia's fiancé, the heir of the Vidrato family. Bring him to me immediately, I've got to teach that pretentious adventurer some lesson. Gregory's aura exploded when he heard Lumilia confirmed it. His aura shook the entire room. Lumilia felt being pressured just by standing in front of the lord of Vidrato family. Although Gregory looked like a fat merchant, he was still a powerful man that was currently leading the whole Vidrato family. You can't. Lumilia said while gritting her teeth. Why? Gregory shouted, and it shook the whole room once again. The mana that he was releasing was reaching its limit. Calm down, that's my daughter you're talking to. Ursus looked at Gregory and said. He slightly released his own mana to counter the mana Gregory was releasing. Gregory looked at Ursus before he sat down. He said, I'm sorry for the sudden outburst. It's just that man harmed my son. Yeah, I understand it. Ursus nodded his head in understanding. He then looked at his daughter and asked, so can you tell us the reason why you said that words? Lumilia took a deep breath while she closed her eyes. After a few moments, she opened her eyes and looked at them with a serious expression. Lumilia slowly opened her mouth and said, "It's because he is Souta from Mage Class 1B. Part 5 of the series ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe so we can be motivated to make even better videos in the future.